I extend a very hearty welcome to all of you. We are here to pay tribute to Dr. Malcolm Adiseshiah. As we all know, he was a great development economist by training, but he wore many hats. His greatest commitment to eradicate poverty and illiteracy and to foster growth in a modern economy. He was an institution builder, and the Madras Institute of Development Study in Chennai was closest to his heart. He continued his support to teaching and research even after his death in 1994, willing all his finances to the setting of a trust. The Malcolm and Elizabeth Adiseshiah Trust was born in 1999. Dr. Adiseshiah engagement with India International Center dates back to 1960s, when he played a major role in getting UNESCO affiliation to the center. He became a member of the center of its Council for Cultural Studies and was later elected Life Trustee. IIC became his hub when he was in Delhi. In 1980s, he was convener of Economic Affairs Group that was entrusted with the task of reviewing the functioning of center from its inception. Dr. Adiseshiah initiated the mid-year review of Indian economy at India International Center in 1975-76, which even today is one of the definitive surveys of India's growth projection. It examines the course of macroeconomic trends for the first half of the year and provides an assessment of the prospects of the economy for the full year. Since 2001, the Trust has supported this annual seminar at the Center, the proceedings of which are later published as a book. For the past 8 years, this event has been hosted by the Center in collaboration with NCAER, and the book is also published jointly. Each year, an eminent invited speaker evaluates the outlook of the discussed year. It is our privilege to welcome Professor Sudipto Mundle and the entire panel and look forward to the deliberations. As we all know, our country is facing economic slowdown, and it has created multiple problems in the country. Particularly the infrastructure sector has been very badly hit. Job crisis has never been more serious than what is today. So I'm sure that today Professor Mundle is going to present completely a realistic picture to us, and he would also perhaps indicate as to what is the way forward to take our economy out of this morass. So with these few words, I once again extend hearty welcome to all of you. Thank you very much.
Shri K. and Srivastava, Director of IIC, and ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here again on this November morning. I wish the AQI was a little better, but here we are with another media review of the Indian economy. When IIC approached us several years back, we readily accepted the mantle of continuing the tradition that Malcolm Adiseshiah so eminently launched in 1976. NCR regularly monitors the Indian economy. We do quarterly forecasts, we do surveys of business expectations. So this is very much part and parcel of what the National Council of Applied Economic Research does. And it actually helps us both put the analysis, the forecasts together, but also gives us an opportunity to vet them with a very distinguished audience that comes to the India International Center, consisting both of its own members, but of course invited guests as well. We're particularly privileged this year in two ways. Professor Sudipto Mundle joined NCR as a distinguished scholar some months back and has thrown himself into our macro and forecasting work. And so we are very pleased to have him with us. Sudipto is an old friend, one of India's best macroeconomists, and certainly his joining our team has greatly expanded the work we are doing. I also want to recognize Rudrani Bhattacharya, who's also a macroeconomist, and this is the kind of collaboration that think tanks like ours should be doing. Rudrani is at NIPFP, and we are very pleased that we are doing this together with NIPFP. We also will have Pranab Sen, former Chief Statistician of India, and somebody who watches over the Indian economy very closely, and he'll be with us when we do the panel discussion in the afternoon. Mr. Srivastava has already laid out the challenge in front of us and the challenge in front of the country. We seem to be in a perfect storm situation where consumer demand, investment demand, foreign demand all seem to have been impacted. And I think we need to find a way out of this situation. I'm very pleased that there are members here who write frequently about this, who actually sit on decision-making committees of the RBI and others. So this is going to be, I hope, a very rich discussion. As Mr. Srivastava said, we do produce a book out of this, and we hope that that will also add to the kind of solutions that we are looking for. This media review is very timely because the Ministry of Finance is busily preparing the budget, and some of this feeds into the budget discussions. The Ministry of Finance invites several of us to come to a discussion prior to the budget, and many of the things that are discussed here are ported to that discussion by me and by others who are present here. So we hope to have a very good discussion. We will try to stick to the time so that we can finish also on time. We will first have the NCAR team led by Sudipto and Dr. Bornali Bhandari, who has been the mainstay of this work for several years now, give us a view along with Rudrani Bhattacharya of the economy, and then after tea we will go to the panel discussion. We have 4 eminent speakers who will be introduced at the panel itself, and then there'll be an open session where we can all field our questions to the panelists and our own views about what needs to be done to shift to a different trajectory in these very difficult times. So with that, let me stop and turn over to Professor Sudipto Mundle to start the presentation of NCR's findings on the economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. Let me join Ms. Srivastava and you in welcoming everybody this morning to our presentation of the media review. As was mentioned, this is now a long-established tradition in paying homage to Dr. Malcolm Adiseshiah, who had started this many years ago. And for the last 8 years or so, NCR has been partnering IIC. So we are continuing an old tradition, but I do want to mention at least one of a few small changes, and that is the new partnership we have with NIPFP, which Dr. Shekhar Shah just mentioned. When I came on board at NCR a few months ago, I suggested to him and to Dr. Atin Roy, the director of my former institute, the NIPFP, that given the fact that we are all resource constrained, why don't we join forces and combine the macroeconomic teams of the NCR and the NIPFP? And both of them very enthusiastically responded to this. We now have a joint team working on the macro side from the two institutes. There are 2 parts to this work. One is policy simulation modeling, which looks at the impact of changes in policies or other shocks to the system, and that's not what we are discussing today. But the other part is a forecasting exercise based on a model which we have jointly developed. And Professor Rudrani Bhattacharya is here, as Shekhar mentioned, to make that present. So we will start a presentation with Rudrani walking you very briefly through the model, hopefully without getting too technical, and then Bornali is going to walk us through the trends in the real economy as well as on the trade sector. And then I'll come back briefly towards the end with a few remarks on what's happening on the policy front. So, with your permission, if I can request Rudrani now.
Before you start, Rudrani, may I just recognize another person of a great importance to us, at least at NCER, and somebody who has a direct connection to Malcolm Adiseshiah. I want to recognize our good friend Shashank Bhide. Dr. Shashank Bhide was until recently the director of MIDS, but before that, of course, was research director at NCER. And after his retirement from MIDS, he has very kindly agreed to come back to NCER. And we're just very privileged to have him as well, because he was, up until recently, the director of the Madras Institute of Development Studies. So, Shashank, thank you. Rudrani, please.
So hello, good morning. I'm Rudrani Bhattacharya from National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, and I'm going to present a joint work by NIPFP and NCER. So we are basically going to present the nowcast for quarterly growth rate of India for Q2 2019-20 and and forecast for annual growth rate of India for 2019-20 financial year. So for nowcast, basically the idea is that to predict the GDP for a particular quarter, GDP growth for a particular quarter from a large number of high frequency indicators. And we can do that by using those indicators. We can predict the GDP number with whenever the GDP numbers are not yet released. So CSO is coming with the quarter 2 2019-20 numbers in a few days, but we are using the high frequency indicators. We can predict the growth for this quarter right now, which we say that it's a 0 month ahead nowcast. We can also do a 1 month ahead of release of GDP numbers or 2 month ahead of release of GDP numbers, depending on the release of information of the high frequency information in that particular quarter. So that's how the idea is. So we use for nowcasting we use a large array of monthly indicators. Those indicators include industrial variables. These are IIP, production of two-wheelers, production of commercial vehicles. Service variables include cargo handled at major ports, number of tourist arrivals, number of mobile connections. Monetary variables include food credit, non-food credit, aggregate deposits. External variables, exports, non-oil imports. Price, CPI for industrial workers, and fiscal variables include revenue receipts and net tax revenue. So we use a factor-augmented time-varying parameter regression model. Basically, the idea is that we estimate factors from all these large number of indicators so basically by doing that we process information from this large number of indicators and reduce the dimension of variables in a small number of factors. And then we regress the quarterly GDP growth, quarterly year-on-year GDP growth on those factors where the coefficient of regression coefficients are varied over time. So those are not constant. We varied them over time. By doing that, we are able to capture the rapid changes in the Indian economy, and that's suitable for emerging economies which are subject to quite random shocks and structural changes. So that's how the model is. And finally, how do we obtain the nowcast? So we have estimated the model till the quarter 1 2019-20 using the data till that. Now from the monthly indicators we have the growth rate, we have the information available till Q2 2019-20. So using the parameters estimated till Q1 1920 and the growth rates from monthly indicators that we have from Q2 2019-20, we nowcast for GDP growth of Q2 2019-20. That's the idea of getting the nowcast for this quarter. So that's what we get. And this is how our model performs and what the nowcast we get. So we find that we all the turning points. So the black line is the actual GDP quarterly year-on-year growth series, and green line is the predicted, is the model generated series. So we see that our model is able to capture the turning points in the quarterly year-on-year growth rate of Indian GDP almost quite accurately, and like it could get the dips in 2008 global financial crisis, drought of 2009. Then in recent years, the 2016-17, the effect of demonetization in 2017 Q1. The demonetization happened in 2016 Q4, but the effect is visible in 2017 Q1. That trough is being picked up by our model itself. So yeah. So then our nowcast for Q2 2019-20 is 4.9, and that's our point forecast with 68% probability it can go to either 5 or 4. So there is a 68% probability, this is the point forecast, there is a 68% probability that it will go to 5 or 4. Okay. So this is for a quarter, is it? This is for quarterly year-on-year growth. Q2 2019.
You see the actual 15 days from now.
Right, yeah, that's the one. That's right.
Yeah.
Next, we do a forecast of annual GDP growth that we do using annual indicators, because this is a forecast, and since we do not have any indicators for annual GDP to predict which are available ahead of GDP release, so we now in our model we regress the GDP growth on the factors of the previous periods, not that same period. That's how the model is changed. So here, sorry. That's how the model is changed. So it's regressed on the previous periods. And these are the annual indicators that we choose. So stock of food grains, development expenditure of the total development expenditure of center and state as a percentage of GDP, non-development expenditure of center and state as a percentage of GDP, real non-food credit, real effective exchange rate, real interest rate, real money, foreign exchange reserves in real terms, fiscal deficit at percentage of GDP at market prices, growth of gross capital formation, and ratio of export to import. So using these indicators, when we forecast using this is also a time varying coefficient model, dynamic model, when we estimate it. So this is the model, this is the annual GDP growth model. Black line is the actual GDP growth, and green line is the predicted one. And we get that for the financial 2019-20, our GDP will be growing at 4.9%. With, again, there is a 68% probability that it will go 5.9 or 3.9.
Within that range.
Within that range.
What is the window of your time varying coefficient?
It's not window, so it's a.
It's not a rolling coefficient.
No, it's not rolling. It's state space model.
Okay.
So it's estimated by Kalman filtering. So thank you. So this what it is.
Thank you.
Good morning, and
Turn on the microphone.
Yeah.
good morning, and so we'll try to explain where why these numbers make sense to us, depending on what we've seen in the last quarter or quarter two. What we see is the first is that the GDP growth has annually between 15-16 to 18-19, we know it has gradually declined. The one important message that I want to emphasize is that even though that shows 7.2 to 6.8 between 17-18 and 18-19, it hides aggregate quarterly variations. And when you look at the quarter right here, it has been a steady fall downwards from 8.1% in quarter 4 to 5% in 19-20 quarter 1. The similar story, we see that in GVA growth also, gross value added. It's a mirror story that it has fallen, and it kind of fits in with, in quarter 2, the nowcast is suggesting that it's going to be 4.9%, subject to a confidence interval, of course. When we look at sectors, individual sectors, we look at agriculture, industry, services. The first sector is agriculture growth. Agriculture growth, GVA has pretty much collapsed in 18-19 quarter, the last 3 quarters of quarter 3, quarter 4, and quarter 1. It did show some marginal recovery here, but it's been in a different base. And this actually shows up in the aggregate variation 2, annual variation 2, where we've seen a steady fall in agricultural GDP in the annual numbers. When we look at the southwest monsoon, here I'm trying to show you 2 things here. The first thing is that at the end of the southwest monsoon, we had a normal monsoon, but there's always a but. The but is that there were spatial and temporal variations. So the first thing is, if you look at these numbers, the lime green colors, it's showing you the rainfall that what was in June, the variation from the long period average of last 10 years, and the blue numbers are showing you what was at the end of the rainfall, June to September. What we find is that across regions, the variation was quite in deficit at the end of June. But when we at the end of the season, we find that all India was slightly above, that was 10% greater than the long period average. But in the east, there was a minor deficit, north almost made it, and the west, there was an excess rainfall. So at the end, there have been spatial and temporal variations, but even this picture does not end the story, because we know that post-monsoon also there has been rainfall which have affected crops and crops quality. Based on area-weighted rainfall, we estimate, NCR has an independent model of estimating the Kharif output, and what that suggests, based on these econometric estimates, that that we are going to have higher output than last year. Of course, the first advanced estimates of Ministry of Agriculture first advanced estimates suggest much lower output, but these estimates are subject to some downward adjustments because of the post-monsoon rainfall. But based on the area-weighted rainfall, we suggest that there's going to be a higher output than last year. So the agriculture is, the message is that agriculture, there is going to be some buoyancy in agriculture. How much is a story, but how much is subject to final estimates, but there is some buoyancy in the agriculture sector in terms of kharif production, and the Rabi outlook also looks optimistic for one reason, that the water storage is from the dams. We know that our water storage is optimum capacity, and because of the rains, there's a groundwater is also moist. So both suggest that Rabi outlook is going to be optimum. When we go to industry, and that's where that's the key story message here. That the industry growth, if you look at just the annual averages, it would suggest that between 17-18 and 18-19 industrial growth went up. But that's not the real story. The real story lies here between 18-19 quarter one to 19-20 quarter one. Pretty much our estimates show that industrial growth has collapsed. It's a steady, continuous fall downwards. It is a steady slipping down. And when we look at the more current indicators from quarter two, the story even turns worse, because this is your IIP general, which shows negative output for quarter two and negative growth for quarter two, and so does IIP manufacturing, which is 77% of the weight. So the industrial growth story is quite gloomy. When we look at services, with this services pattern is slightly more mixed, at least from these variations. If you look at the quarterly and annual variations, though in 19-20 quarter one, even this actually showed decline between 2 quarters. But when we look at the more recent indicators from quarter two, again, all these indicators are showing a very sharp decline in the last few quarters. The important thing is, this is something that as an observer we are always looking out for, there's a sustained decline in cargo traffic across transport modes. So here both railways has declined and ports have declined. The black and the red lines are ports and railways, and this one, the red line, is the air cargo traffic, which again shows a decline. So across air, railways, and ports, we see a decline in cargo traffic, which actually suggests that economic activity is at a lower levels. When we look at this, so this was the real side. When we look at the demand side, as Dr. Shah already mentioned, we find that real private consumption expenditure has fallen. Again, here the story is the annual numbers hide the quarterly fall. From 9.8% to 3.1%, and so C has fallen, investment has fallen. We can see investment completely, significantly falling down from 11.7% to 3.6% in quarter four, and then quarter one there's some marginal recovery. Again here, if you just look at the annual numbers, this hides the significant variations in the quarter. I do want to add here is that if you look at capital goods index of industrial production, that has been shown negative growth for 9 months. The pictures are not here, but it's in the report. That and even consumer durable goods have been have shown negative growth since June 2019, and I think the most worrying part that we have is the consumer non-durable goods, which have shown negative growth in September 2019. So that would suggest that people are even cutting down on essential goods. And then along with that, even government demand expenditure has fallen. And here we find there's significant compression of government expenditure. Even quarter one, it showed only 8.8% growth. So on the demand side, we have fallen, and when we look at the external side, external demand, exports and imports, what we find here is that, again, exports have also steadily fallen. This is exports of goods and services in rupee terms. It has fallen from the high of 26.1% to the 1.9% in quarter two. And imports have actually declined. Since we do import a lot of capital goods, I think it's a signal for a large, it's not a signal on consumption, it's a signal on production activity within the economy. So both on the supply side and demand side, we have had challenges, and ultimately, when we look at the business sentiments have fallen by 15.3% between last quarter and this quarter, first and second. They have only deepened. When we look at other indicators of business sentiments, but the Nikkei Purchasers Managers Index for manufacturing and services, here again we find that PMI manufacturing actually fell in October, and PMI services has been below 50 for 2 consecutive months of September and October. With generally fall in output activities and demand. Here we find the end of inflation. What is inflation telling us? And here the interesting story is that this is emerging. While inflation was moderating in the first part of the year, or it remained below the RBI inflation target, we find that in September, there has been slight increase in inflation, in the retail inflation, CPI, headline inflation, whereas WPI has declined. So there is some divergence taking place between WPI and CPI, the red and the black line. You can see this completely going in different directions. The last point that I sort of want to emphasize is this core CPI. The core CPI inflation, which is the non-food and the non-fuel inflation energy, is actually going down. So which suggests, and which actually shows up in the numbers, that we know fuel and light inflation has been quite moderate. So CPI inflation, headline inflation, is essentially being driven by food inflation. And that sort of is what some of the story that has happened in last year. And pass on the baton to Dr. Mundle now.
Thank you, Bornali. So we saw there a rather grim picture of what's going on in the real economy, and it's very widespread. It's not just limited to manufacturing. I mean, it's fairly widespread across the economy. Some relief this year from agriculture, and what is really worrying, as she mentioned, is that the dip in inflation, which is something normally you welcome. But when you see that it is all being, the increase is being driven by food prices, in fact, you split it. There's not enough time, so she didn't go into it, but you split it between rural and urban. It's really being driven by urban food prices, especially fruits and vegetables, whereas not in the rural sector at all. It's going down. Other prices are rising in rural areas. So that, again, is a pointer to the considerable distress that we have, especially in the rural sector. But moving on now to look at what's happening on the policy front. The RBI actually has been very active, and in particular the Monetary Policy Committee, of which we have a distinguished representative here, Professor Chetan Ghate, in steadily bringing down the policy rate, what we call the repo rate, from about 6.5% to 5.15% now. The idea being that if you bring down the policy rate, this will gradually bring down the interest rates, commercial interest rates in the market, and that will help drive credit and therefore revive economic growth. I mean, that's the theory. What you find actually has been happening. Yeah. What?
Red one. This red.
Yeah, what you actually find has been happening is this is going down, this is the policy rate, but the weighted average lending rate of banks taken as a whole, you find that it's really not going down. And in fact, this is all about the lending rate on fresh loans. I'm not talking about the average lending rate for the stock of loans, because that, of course, can move up and down depending on what's been paid back, what has been written off, and so on. And also, if you look at the term deposit rates of banks, this is also not really going down. So there's been some reflection of this decrease, the transmission, but very, very marginal. So, in effect, the issue that is arising out of this is, can monetary policy at this juncture really do anything to try and revive demand and revive growth? And the answer seems to be that it is unlikely. Now, why is that happening? Why is the transmission not happening? If you think about it, what do commercial banks do? They get money at a certain cost and they lend it. Now, obviously, the rate at which they can lend, those average lending rates, are driven by the cost that they have to bear, namely, let's say, the interest rate they pay on fixed deposits and so on. And that, in turn, is driven by what options savers have compared to putting their money in the banks. And that's what we are trying to capture here. Here you see that policy rate I talked about earlier, which has been steadily coming down. Then you see that green line there. That is the 91-day treasury bill of the government. That has also more or less, caught up with that's reflecting the decline. Transmission is happening there. The blue line there is the benchmark one-year government security, and there also it is happening. But when you look at the 10-year GSEC, that is the benchmark rate, and that has not really come down very much. In fact, it is higher than the 5-year fixed deposit rate of, say, the State Bank of India. Now, in addition to that, also there's, of course, the small savings schemes, the national small savings schemes, and the interest rate there. That also has remained elevated. So when savers have these options, why would they put their money into fixed deposits in banks? So the banks cannot therefore reduce very easily the interest rates on their fixed deposits, and they can't do that, then they can't reduce the lending rate. Therefore, your transmission is not happening. Let me now move on to the credit story. That is partly driven, of course, by interest rate, but by also other policies of the RBI and general conditions in the market. Here we are looking at non-food credit. Why non-food? Because food credit is largely banks giving money to the food corporation, which is more an administrative type of affair, depends on the procurement, and that money is always available depending on how much the food corporation wants to borrow. So it's really the non-food credit which gives you an idea of what's going on in the rest of the economy, and you can see that that also has been steadily coming down from Q3 of 18-19. Very sharp kind of decline in non-food credit, which of course is a reflection of the decline in economic activity. Now a question arises, is this going down because people are not wanting to borrow money, they don't want to invest, or is it happening because the banks are not prepared to lend? Now here is an interesting picture you see over there. This is a breakdown of the credit flow by different categories of borrowers. And you see over here what's happening to the micro and small industries and the medium industries. The credit to them is actually going down. There has been a shrinkage in credit to the services sector as a whole. The industrial sector, it's been growth but very small. This is the allied, agriculture allied is the food corporation, so that story is not particularly interesting. But this is the part where the crowding out is really happening. It's happening because today the public sector borrowing requirement, that is of the central government, state government, public enterprise, all taken together, is over 9% of GDP, when the entire financial savings of the household sector is about 7%. So the government is not only dipping into the entire financial savings of the household sector, but also that of the corporate sector, and you're seeing here the kind of crowding out that is going on. So that was the monetary side story. Now let's look at what's happening on the fiscal side. Here is tax revenue. This is what happened last year compared to the year before. The growth rate in tax revenue, it was 8.5%. If you compare what happened to actual tax revenue as against the budget for last year, it actually fell short of the budget target by 8.5%. Now, given that background and the fact what is happening now, our tax revenues are growing at 1.5%. This is half year over half year. So it's a good indicator rate at which the annual tax revenue will likely rise. We are only growing at 1.5%. What's the target? 18.3%. You can see here the completely unrealistic projections in the budget. And already a couple of days ago, the Central Board of Directors did say that they are going to fall short by about 1.5 million rupees on their tax revenues. Now, where is this shortfall happening? The large shortfall actually is happening in indirect taxes, which accounts for about 41% of total revenue, not just tax, but total revenue. And you can see the shortfall. The target here for this year is 17.5%. What are we doing? We are actually falling short of last year by 2.1%. Now, all of this is getting reflected, therefore, in the total revenue, but partly buoyed by what's happening on the non-tax revenue side, and especially dividends and profits which the central government is getting out of financial and non-financial public sector enterprises, especially the large take on the dividends from the Reserve Bank of India, which has grown at a phenomenally high rate following the Jalan Committee recommendations. And because of that, non-tax revenue has grown by over 90%, and it's partly moderating the shortfall on the tax revenue side. But this only accounts for about 11% of total revenue. So the net story is that our net revenue receipts are growing at 11% compared to a budget target of 19%. So a huge compression, a huge shortfall in government revenues. Now, that is, of course, getting reflected on the expenditure side. And here you see what is happening. This is the central government's total expenditure. It grew at 8.5%. That is what actually happened in 17-18 over the previous year. This is what happened last year compared to the previous year. So it's growing at around 8% or so. If you look at this year, expenditure is a little better. It's growing at 14% compared to what happened in the corresponding period last year. However, the target again is completely unrealistic to grow by 20%. This is nowhere near what has been achieved in the last 2 or 3 years. So again, there's likely to be a huge compression in government expenditure this year on top of the compression that happened last year. This is the same picture being shown in terms of revenue expenditure, which is the bulk of government expenditure. But let's keep to this side of the story. So our take is that to some extent, the decline in growth, apart from very bad conditions globally, internally, etc., is actually policy driven. It was the huge expenditure compression last year, which partly accounts for the dip in growth. And we are getting another compression on top of that this year. And this is likely to reduce our growth even further. Now, of course, you could have allowed this expenditure not to get compressed because of revenue shortfall by allowing the deficit to increase. But these are our targets. This is what was the actual deficit. This is the this is 17-18 actual last year. Against a budget target of 3.3%, we contained it at 3.4%. Why? Because the expenditure was compressed. You didn't want to pass it on as an enlarged deficit. And this year, the budget estimate is 3.3%. Our expectation is that it might slip a little bit, but not too much, because of the fact that already the public sector borrowing requirement is too high and it is keeping up yield rates and so on in the financial sector. So probably again we are going to see a large compression. In fact, that's already happening. As I showed you, this year also we have seen so far a substantial contraction in government, both revenue as well, contraction growth of revenue as well as expenditure. And we think that that's going to continue and adversely affect growth. However, I do want to end on a somewhat positive note, and this goes back to the forecast that Rudrani now cast and forecast, that we're probably bottoming out, because we have seen this huge dip in growth from the year before to last year, and if you look at the quarterly growth rates that we showed you. But 4.9% is what we are expecting as the nowcast for the second quarter. And we are also saying that the growth for the year as a whole is likely to be 4.9%. So what that suggests to you is that probably we are now at the bottom. It's been a huge steep decline, but hopefully won't get worse than that. So let me end there. Thank you.
With my co-chair's permission, what I would suggest, given that we are keeping very much to our time, that we use the remaining 28 minutes or so for a Q&A already on what has been presented. The focus, of course, has been very short-term. There are longer-term and medium-term issues as well, including our trade relationships with Asia, with the West, a number of other issues on climate, the environment, water scarcity. There are a number of these larger issues, jobs, of course, and our demography. So what I would suggest is if people can keep their questions short so that we can get as many as we possibly can, and then we'll request the team to respond. So if you have long comments, leave them for the nice long tea break that we have. But if you can please identify yourself. This is being live streamed. I should have said that in the very beginning. So the entire world has access to this. So you may wish to note that and remember that when you speak. And for that reason, this is not to, of course, censor you in any way. Please feel free to say what you want. IIC has always stood for pluracy and for open debate and discussion, and NCR as well. So with that, let me thank the team. I think this is a wonderful explanation of, and what's very nice is that they make it accessible to all of us who are not technically oriented. I should note that our forecasts are on the optimistic side. Abhik Barua is here from HDFC, and so he knows what all the market economists are saying. And I have decidedly seen numbers like 4.2% for the quarter. So you will have a chance to come back on that. So let's hold your fire for the moment. But there will be, I'm sure, a lot of discussion in the next few days. I should also mention another thing that hasn't been mentioned here, which is the NCR Index of Business Confidence that we also do, and that also is a barometer of how the 500 firms that we survey feel about both the current situation and the immediate future. And of course, they see it from their own firm's point of view. But this is something we've been doing for a large number of years, and it's usually a good barometer of what is coming, or a good predictor of how in the corporate sector or firms in particular feel about the economy. With that, perhaps you could open it up. If you can just raise your hand so that I can see, or Mr. Srivastav can see, then we can go around and have a few questions. Again, may I please request everybody keep it short and keep it to a question. So please, sir. There's a microphone right in front of you.
Ease of business, we've improved so much internationally. Where is that translating into? Is there a lag where we will then start doing better, or is it something that is not affecting investment because of some other reason? What is the problem? Thank you.
That's a nice, short and very sharp question. Please, sir. The gentleman here. You can use the microphone right in front of you as well.
Mundle, you pointed out the general conditions that are declined globally. Therefore, the production quality and growth has gone down. But you hinted that the government was also not making the right moves. Would you like to point out one or two of these moves that they could have done and prevented this decline?
Excellent question. Yes, sir.
My name is Alamdar Abbas, and first of all, I am giving heartiest congratulations to India International Center along with National Council of Applied Research to organize such a significant and remarkable function here. I hope it would develop a new tendency of India would show a new path of global peace to make India most powerful nation of the world. I am writing a book also,
Yeah,
India
could we come to the question, please?
2040. And now I may ask you a question. I think control inflation and reduce revenue deficit, increase domestic product and check and moderate our fiscal policy and monetary policy for to make India most powerful nation of the world.
Thank you. Professor Panda?
Yeah, I'm Manoj Panda from Institute of Economic Growth. Last 2-3 quarters, every time we are hearing that we have bottomed out. And every time we expect a better growth, but actually it is turning out to be the worst. So what are the factors this time that the team is more optimistic that it will be better in the coming quarters?
Looks like we have some interference from somewhere, I hope. Yeah, we are being live streamed, so it's probably the web team that is doing this. Sudipto, do you want to take these? And then I'll come to you and I'll come to the others who have raised their hands. Sudipto?
Just loudly. Oh, it's on now. Good. On the ease of doing business, why it's not showing up and so on, I think the panelists, particularly Mr. Bhattacharya Chatterjee, who's here, will be able to give a better response to that since he has his feet in the market. And so I'm going to leave that for him to answer. On the question of what we think, that's a very good question, thank you, about what we think the government is not doing right. I'm not going to get into other areas of policy which have to do with structural reform and so on, because this is a very short-term media review, but to stick to the macro questions, I think the monetary policy side, the central bank, quite apart from all the huge problems of non-performing loans and so on, which is a different issue, it's trying to deal with that, it's taking time. But that apart, on the actual interest rate policy, as I said earlier, I think the MPC has done what it needed to do. It might, I don't know, they might still continue to lower the interest rate, but that's a bit like pushing on a loose string, because that's not getting transmitted to lower interest rates in the market. The problem really is on the fiscal side and an inadequate recognition of the problem. As you know, the main interventions that happened, reducing the corporate rate, putting some money for, recapitalizing the banks, etc. Now, those are all, if you will, attempts to revive the economy from the supply side. And whereas the problem really is on the demand side and to get money into the hands of consumers, especially poor consumers with a high propensity to consume, so that quickly the income multiplier gets generated. Now that recognition has not been there adequately. An analysis of what really is the problem. There has been responses have been more piecemeal, do this, do that. I think largely in response to lobbying groups who have more visibility and voice than others. So that really is my answer on that. On the question of why we think we have bottomed out, we may not have bottomed out. I was only pointing to a possible silver lining. At least that's what the model is telling us. It's a model that has performed very well in the past, so we have some confidence in it. But as you know very well, models are models and forecasts are forecasts with error margins, as both my partners did emphasize. We'll know in 2 weeks. It's very critical what we see in the quarterly figures that will come out in 2 weeks from now, whether we are actually bottoming out or not. But since we have been painting a very gloomy picture, I just thought, almost a throwaway comment, I'll draw some attention to the fact that we may be bottoming out. And I recognize that our forecast has turned out to be a little less pessimistic than that by Nomura and others, which are saying that we are going to end up the year with 4.2%.
Thank you, Sudipto. The lady here, and can we get her a microphone? I think there are, maybe we need a few more handheld microphones. Can we arrange them? I'll come to you, sir.
Yeah, my name is Anu Chindal, and thank you for all the figures you presented, even though they were all very dismal. So my question is that you've actually partially answered my question, why? Why are they so dismal, and where is the hope of the change? So that also he says we bottomed out. So can you just reflect the other speakers on why, the reasons why they're so dismal?
We'll come to that. The gentleman there. First, the gentleman, I saw him. I'll recognize you then.
Thank you, sir. A.K. Jain, I am from the urban sector. Very good study, very comprehensive. My question is that are we looking at some non-conventional, innovative sources of financing? For example, we have been focusing too much on agriculture and industries, manufacturing. But many countries have gone with higher education, maybe entertainment and property rights, etc. These kind of things. Are we looking at this as to revigorate our economy?
Thank you. Please.
SS Bhakdi, well, in its own way, it is an annual brainstorming session under the aegis of NCA, ISC and all that. One first question is that during the last 6-7 years, the SME and MSME sector is plummeting as compared to the large industries. Though it is the largest provider of employment, about 11.3 crore, 29% of GDP, and exports around about 45. So, what is being done for the SME and MSME sector? Number one. Number two, the same is state GDP from 8.1% or 8.5%, it has come down to below 5%. Well, I have one figure with me that between 2014 and 2019, the average GDP of a 5-year block was 7.3%. This is the first time that in the post-independent India, such an average was attained in a 5-year block between 2014 and 2019, 7.3%. And now it can be anything below 5%, 4.1%, 4.2%. So what is being done so that these indicators are buffed and bolstered in the years to come?
Thank you. Any further questions? If not, we still have 10-15 minutes. So, yeah, please.
I'm Lakshmi, journalist from PTI. I need one clarification. This forecast is for the Q2 of calendar year and forecast for the full fiscal or the calendar?
So the Q2 is the fiscal year. Yeah. So it's the forecast.
So why not for Q2 is for the fiscal, right?
Right. So that the quarter that ends in September. And the data will come out shortly. So that's the nowcast. The annual forecast is for the full fiscal year. Right. So that's a technical question that I can even answer. Anybody else here who, otherwise I'm going to, yes, please, behind.
Yes, Sarang Shidore, University of Texas. Quick question on trade compositions. We have 3 sunrise globalized sectors in India, for the most part, the autos, pharmas and ITES. So wondering if you see any green shoots of the emergence of any new sectors or subsectors that are that we are seeing an uptick on exports on, that we can hope for as the new tigers in the future at some point.
That's a very important question, hopefully heralding change. Could I throw in a question about the recent events in Bangkok where we, for the moment at least, have declined to join RCEP? And that, in a sense, has really led to quite an outpouring of both support and opposition, and lamenting the fact that Indian industry has lost a chance to pull itself up by its bootstraps and actually begin to compete more effectively against the rest of the world, and particularly Asia, where market growth is likely to be the highest. So that seems to have also added to the pallor and the gloom, at least in some minds, and be useful to think about that in terms of the investment confidence that Indian industry has in itself. The CII president has written a very forceful op-ed the other day, suggesting very strongly that we should be competing against the rest of the world and not protecting ourselves. So that's also something that's in the background of these very short-term issues that we are contending with, but we must not lose sight of the medium and the longer-term issues as well. So any further questions? Otherwise, I'm going to give Mr. Srivastava, please.
Sudipto, I have got a very simple question to ask. You mentioned that despite the repo rate going down, it is not making any impact on the lending and deposit rates so far the banks are concerned, since the deposit rates are continuing to be at the same level and therefore the lending rate has to be higher than that. Now, for common investors, what are the safe avenues available for investment other than the banks? So if the banks decide to reduce the deposit rates, the depositors have really no option. And I read the statement of Reserve Bank governor that hereafter Reserve Bank is going to ensure that whatever reduction is going to be done in repo rate actually gets reflected in the lending rates. So I'd like to have your comments on this.
I'll come back, but maybe Bornali would like to take a couple of the questions asked and then I'll come back. What about?
After you, I'll just
So I'll answer 3 questions about the why. I think what we showed here is essentially there's been, the economy on the demand side is being driven by 4 factors. There's external demand, there is private consumption demand, investment demand, and government expenditure. If you look at these 4 components, essentially what we're saying is private expenditure has collapsed. Consumer durables goods have been falling for 9 months in a row. If that's not a signal of anything, I don't know what is. And the worst part is that now consumer non-durable goods, which basically means food, clothing, shelter, is actually falling. So has also showed negative growth rate in September, which was one of the things holding up. So private consumption expenditure is falling. Exports of goods and services have fallen to a paltry 1.9%. So that means there's no external demand. There are many reasons, don't take up all the time. But for a variety of reasons, we have not been able to leverage our advantage, one of them being the mention of the RCEP point, which has again been more expanded in the report. The third thing is investment demand has fallen. Business sentiments are falling. Investment demand has fallen both for supply and demand reasons, but mainly for demand reasons, supply reasons of the fact that for the NPA problems, banks are not willing to lend. So and other reasons where basically rates are not weak transmission of rates. So C, I, G all have fallen. External demand is not there. Where is the demand? And the government is not in a position, as Dr. Bhandari has pointed out, that it's not in a position to expand expenditure. So where is the demand going to come from? Of course, on the supply side, our agriculture is subject to vagaries of this thing. We thought we had a good monsoon, but post-monsoon there have been issues. So, the challenges are various. The structural reasons, small reasons. So these together explain why we see such a gloomy outlook. About the MSME sector, the government has done has the Mudra loan, which was supposed to enhance credit to the micro, small and medium enterprises. But when we look at the picture here, we see that specifically the credit to micro, small and medium enterprises are not going up. There is a small addition that even when the business sentiments, we have it by firm size. And when we see that even business sentiments by firm size seem to have fallen across firm sizes, I think the only green shoot here that we can say is that we find that the micro firms, that is firms with annual turnover less than 1 crore, show some improvement in sentiments. But given that they have seen very large fall in the last 2 quarters in sentiments, just going above by a moderate amount doesn't really make up. So MSMEs, of course, again, there are reasons of demonetization, GST, which they have not, have they been particularly affected by these two shocks to the economy, or especially the implementation of GST. So with a reform, so this not being able to leverage this adds to the compounds the problems. Of course, when the rest of the world is in a shock, it is very hard to match, what we saw in between 2004, 5, and 11, 12. We have to recognize we are part of the world, and the global finance recession has added uncertainty beyond 11, 12. So we are in a period of uncertainty, and within that, we have had our own level of exogenous shocks to the system or policy shocks to the system, which compounds our problem. I think those are a couple of questions to think.
Just to add to Bornali's points, just to add to Bornali's points, the rural sector is also very much depressed. If you look at the real wages, the growth in real wages, that is growing at a negative rate. So the effect of MGNREGA that hiked the minimum wages, because of which the wages everywhere in the all over the India has increased since 2008. That has been now flattened out. So, and also what happened is that after demonetization, there's a lot of in the urban areas and all, there are people who were working in the informal sector and all, and the demonetization hit it very worse, and they left their work in the urban areas and went back to the rural areas and joined the workforce for the MGNREGA. So that actually reduced they put a downward pressure on the rural wages, and now the rural wages are growing at a negative rate. Just I have checked the data and I have seen that it's growing at a so there is no demand from the rural side. And even the food prices are also, in the rural, food prices are also declining, as sir was saying. So that's a big reason for the dismal picture for the economy.
Thanks, Rudrani. So I'll pick up 3 or 4 of the questions that were asked. First of all, let me address your question about options for ordinary investors. People like us. Apart from bank deposits, you have these national small saving schemes in which you can put money, and those, as I said, I mean, from an investor's point of view, that's a good thing. The rates are high, but it means that's why the transmission isn't happening. There is also, by the way, a couple of other options here. Now, there's an app that has been issued. I'm very non-savvy about these things, but you actually, retail investors can put money into long-dated GSECs, which normally it's the banks who put money in those things. Or also, of course, you can buy debt mutual funds. So there are these few options. I'll take the question on RCEP, which Shekhar raised, along with new trade green shoots that was mentioned. I think you're referring to Naushad Forbes. It was, if you will recall, completely different and at variance from the rest of the industry. At the time when we were, before walking away from RCEP and after walking away from RCEP, there was a complete drumbeat right across industry, and it was also the farmers, because they did not want to be exposed to external competition. And this was picked up by the political spectrum across the board. The Swadeshi Jagran Manch, BJP's affiliate, the Congress Party, the CPM, everybody was on the same page, walk away from RCEP. Naushad Forbes, being a very enlightened person, has taken a different tack on this. And this is not, of course, part of a midterm review, but my personal take is that, and I've just written on this yesterday, it came out in Mint on this, that at this juncture probably we didn't have a choice, because we had not been able to negotiate on a number of key points which are very critical for India. There are a number of things there, particularly relating to information sharing and so on, which are actually at variance with some of our internal laws. The same happens with the investment provisions in that. Quite apart from the fact that we were not able to get initially India was trying to get a much smaller spectrum on which tariffs had to be reduced. I think something like 80% for ASEAN countries and only something like 42% for China, but we couldn't sustain that. So there was this worry that there was going to be a huge surge in imports and so on. However, that being said, I think that India has no option eventually, since the multilateral system is breaking down, to go through these regional platforms, and RCEP is a real mega platform, and it's the only game in town, as I've said, because the other one, TPP, has gone. And so we have to be there, but to get advantage of it, we need to do things on our side. Our producers need to also get their act together, raise productivity so that we are competitive. And there's no point saying we are not competitive, so we will not join this. So, but that's easier said than done. I won't go into that now. We don't have time, but I've discussed how the East Asian countries will do this, and that's just 30 seconds, Shekhar, because there was a question there about other policy reforms, education, etc. Those are all very important, but these take time to take effect. And certainly we should do those. But in order to buy the time for these things to take effect, you need to address these, short-term, medium-term things that we've been focusing on. Thank you.
Sudipto, we are about to break for tea, but I particularly want to ask Vinayak, because I think the ease of doing business is an important question, and Vinayak is in the heart of the difficulty or ease of doing business, given the role he plays in the infrastructure sector. So Vinayak, about a minute or so from you.
No, less than a minute. See, there are two different indicators. If you notice the World Economic Forum Index of Competitiveness, we have actually slipped a few points. And if you see the World Bank ease of doing business, it seems to be easier. The only point I want to make is that from Indian industry, we have conveyed to the World Bank that we have some very serious issues on the modalities and methodologies they use to come up with their ease of doing business. And I'll just rest at that.
So with that, I should just add one more thing, that precisely for the reasons that Vinayak mentioned, NCR itself has now been doing something called the State Investment Potential Index that looks more at outcomes rather than the laws as they appear on the books. So as part of our index, which we do every year now, we also have a firm survey. So there's a labor pillar, there's a land pillar, there's a political stability pillar, there's an economic policy. This is state-based, and then there's a survey of firms. We're also working particularly in the land area, given how complex land acquisition, transfers, rehabilitation, recompensation, etc. have become. We're also looking at a land records and services index, precisely to get to the kind of granularity and on-the-ground conditions rather than what appears in the books. With that, let me thank the NCR team, all of you, for joining so actively. Let's break for tea. We'll be back at 11:15. It's a nice, generous half-an-hour tea break. So please talk to our colleagues and raise your questions that we can then reflect in the panel discussion that I'm so glad Pranab is here. Pranab Sen will moderate, and we have 4 very forceful and thoughtful speakers. So please come back at 11:15. Thank you very much.
Check.
Can I request everybody to settle down, please? Where's Abhi? Abhi must be coming. There he is. Okay, we are into the second half of our mid-year review. Thank you everybody for coming back on time. One of the things at NCI we try to do is really make sure that we stick to time. We now have the discussion part and the panel part, and I'm just going to hand over to Dr. Pranab Sen, who is the head of the India Growth Center, International Growth Center, but the India chapter of it, and of course also Chief Statistician and Secretary in MOSPI prior to this role, Chairman of the National Statistical Commission, a range of different responsibilities that he has held, Planning Commission as well. So let me hand over to Pranab, and he can introduce, though everybody knows, I think, most of the people. There's also a sheet, by the way, in your pamphlet or in your package that has everybody's bios. So you can move quickly into the discussion part.
Thank you, Shekhar.
Would you like
second?
Okay.
We'll make a second. Well, welcome to the panel discussion. The topic, as you can read from the handout that's been given, is balancing macro stability and deeper structural reforms for a growth recovery, which, of course, as a title, left me thoroughly confused. I mean, I didn't know you needed to balance those, but apparently NCAER does. There are deep thoughts happening there, which I am not privy to. So, now, having been thoroughly confused, I figured that as the moderator, my job is really not to keep my mouth shut, because I don't know what I'm going to say, and hand it over to the four panelists who presumably have thought about it and have decided to talk on one of the issues or the other. I would like to lead off with Vinayak, because he apparently has a presentation. He loves presentations, and he's got one, which makes a convenient starting point for the others, because then we can actually get into a more discursive mode than would be otherwise if every one of them were to be giving a separate lecture, although we'll have some of that as well. So, Vinay, can we start with you, and then we'll move on.
Thank you. Load the presentation. It's a short 6 slides, and I should be done in 7 minutes, hopefully, other than the 10 allocated by Bornali.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So while they're loading, let's just kick off the discussion. And, as we heard that in the last session, that ITES was one of the sectors that was still holding up. If everybody else is tanking. And since that was mentioned, why don't I ask Debjani Ghosh to kick off? At least we can start on a bright note, and then we'll get to the gloom and doom.
Yeah, OT,
so we'll have this nice downward trajectory.
I was watching on my way to this place. I was actually watching the review on my phone, and I was completely perplexed about what to say here, because I'm not going to fit in much with the gloom and doom story. But there's a logic to the madness that we see, especially in IT. Every time there is a slowdown, and if you go back in history and you look at the various slowdowns that has happened globally, every time there is a slowdown, companies, organizations will look at ways to get more effective, will look at ways to bring in higher efficiencies. In today's world, especially when you're talking about effectiveness, when you're talking about efficiency, some of the emerging technologies and the innovation that we are seeing in these areas, especially AI, IoT, etc., is becoming an absolute must-do for every single CEO. Recently, Gartner had its symposium, and I'm sure you would have seen it. And it's not just Gartner. PwC has called it out, McKinsey has called it out, Accenture has called it out, everyone has called out that one of the top must-dos or top priorities from a CEO perspective is the digital transformation of the business to drive efficiencies, to drive effectiveness in the business. So it's not a surprise that IT spending worldwide is actually going up. In fact, we just had the numbers for India a few days back. India IT spending is going to increase around 6.6% in 2020 to reach around 94 billion. Majority of that is going to be driven by software and services. Software and services is going to grow around 15% and 13% respectively. Everything else is a low single digit. But software and services is where the magic is happening. So we are seeing, so for the industry, especially the industry that NASSCOM looks at, we are cautiously optimistic because, as Bornali, I think, rightly said, we are living in a world of tremendous uncertainty. So we'll never, I will never sit down and say all is good. I mean, we are cautiously optimistic. We grew around 8 to 9% last year. We are 181 billion industry today. We are on a good footing this year. I don't believe in forecasts. I don't believe in predictions given the way the world changes. But we are on a good footing. The trends are good. More importantly, one of the key criteria that everyone looks at, right or wrong, is jobs for this industry. And if you look at jobs, if you look at till September, the top 20 listed companies, despite having changes made, for example, decreasing some of the mid-tier employees, but increasing the entry-level inquiry because the skill levels are changing, the top 20 listed companies would have added around 50,000 net jobs, so created net jobs this year, up to September. The startup ecosystem, the tech startup, and NASSCOM looks only at the tech startup ecosystem, which is around 9,000 odd startups in India. The tech startup ecosystem is adding jobs pretty significantly. Just this year, up to September, they have added around 60,000 direct jobs and around 1.8 lakh indirect jobs. So if the investment in technology is definitely paying off also in terms of job creation, and we are seeing that happen. The one worrying thing, or the one thing I'm most worried about, is that the new technologies that are coming in are creating new jobs, and these require extremely different kind of skills. These do not need the same skills that we had in the past. We are definitely not keeping pace with that change. So we will definitely net, even World Economic Forum has called out, around 60 to 65 billion jobs or million jobs will be lost, but around 130 million jobs, new jobs will be created. But these new jobs are going to look very different. NASSCOM itself has done a study of the 10 emerging technologies and its impact on India, and there are around 55 new job roles that are getting created as we speak, which is giving rise to around 156 different skill set requirements. Our universities, our K-12, our higher education, and companies have to significantly drive this change. That's our worry, that we are going to have the jobs, we are not going to have the right people very soon to fill these jobs. So that's the worry that I have, but that's sort of my outlook for the industry.
Good. I mean, as I said, let's start upbeat. But the numbers are still just so small. Yeah. In the larger scheme of things, you're going to invite a hell of a lot of the bad eye.
I had all my fingers crossed.
I'm sure keep your toes crossed as well. Okay, Vinay, I call yours.
Okay, so good morning everybody, and thank you for the opportunity. This presentation is from practicing businessmen. It is a little intimidating to be presenting to such a high-powered group of senior economists, but I'll try and do my best. The focus of this presentation is to actually give you a solution. And if there is debate and discussion, because I also made this presentation at the PMO and at the Finance Ministry, the Financial Services Wing, and a few other influential people as to what could be a solution to use infrastructure, which is the largest driver of investments, to pump prime the economy. So 6 or 7 slides, I should be done in 6-7 minutes. I think the first thing about the 100 lakh crore figure is the same as the question that comes about the $5 trillion economy. Where does the figure come from? So I think at the time that both these figures were put out into mainstream discussions, as economists, you all know how the three things add up to the $5 trillion. The real growth, inflation, and the rupee-dollar parity. But this chart now is a little kind of behind the times, as you can see, because the growth assumptions it makes are far from the reality that was presented before the tea break. But assuming that at some stage we are going to reach a $5 trillion economy, maybe you'll have to push this whole thing down by 2 or 3 years. If that is so, the only point I want to make here is that the 100 lakh crore figure of investment in infrastructure, there was a doubt that some manifesto writer pulled it out of thin air. It's actually pretty rational. And if you just see that infrastructure in emerging markets, the target when the planning commission existed was to take it to about 9% gross capital formation in infrastructure as a percentage of GDP. So it's not particularly ambitious. You can see it's 6, 7.5, 7.5, 8.5. That's the minimum percentage of GDP that we require investment in infrastructure. And assuming that the 5 trillion figure holds, then the 100 lakh crore figure actually suggests itself, as you can see from the last column. And if you want to be more, and if the $5 trillion economy is going to push outward, then obviously the figure correspondingly with the percentages falls to 89 lakh crores or 69 lakh crores. But for the sake of argument, since there are so many options, let's just stay with the 100 lakh crore figure. And the only point I want to make in this slide that it's a rational target. It's not an irrational target. Next. So the 100 lakh crore figure doesn't happen at 20 lakh crore, 100 divided by 5, but there's a step up. So I've made some reasonable assumptions about it moving from 12, 15, 20, 22, 29, and you add up to 100 in a 5-year band. So for the balance few slides, I'm just going to use the middle figure, 20 lakh crores, to actually offer a proposition as to what we should be doing as a solution to fund 20 lakh crores. Next. So how do we break up this 20 lakh crores? Let's start from the bottom. About 6 lakh crores comes from the Consolidated Fund of India, and I'll tell you exactly how this figure is reasonably rational. There are 4 lakh crores that come from other public funds, which is the state investment in infrastructure, which is urban local bodies, bilateral and multilaterals, PSUs, etc., make up for one of the last economic data points that caught my attention was that last year the state investments in infra were about 2.75 lakh crores, sigma 29 states, or 30 now, whatever. So the 4 lakh is reasonably doable. So the broad point on this slide is that we seem to have a grip on half the amount that the economy requires. The balance 10 is now where we need interventions. We need, and I'm breaking up the balance into a proposition which says we need 2 lakh crores from PPP, which is private investments in infrastructure, and we desperately require a developmental financial institution for the infrastructure sector. This is to share confidentially with you. As I was driving in today, I did get some messages that there is very serious work being done on this idea in the ministry, in the PMO. So fingers crossed, you may see some traction in this idea in the days ahead, but let's see. Now I'm going to argue why an unfashionable PPP doesn't require much discussion. Everybody knows private investment is required. It is DFI which is controversial, saying, oh, you're going back to IDBI days. Private industry is advocating DFI now. God help us. But I'll argue why this is required. So if you see, going back, I said that the central, if I just go back one slide, look at the figure of 6 lakh crores. And I'm saying it's 6 lakhs is rational 2 years from now because we're looking at the 20 lakh crore figure 2 years from now. So if you see the budget allocations for this year, and allocations, of course, I'm hoping will be equal to disbursements, is 4.5 lakh crores broadly across these various ministries. So therefore, projecting 6 lakh crores in 2021 or 2022 doesn't seem irrational. So that 6 lakh crore figure has a certain, shall we say, an underpinning of rationality. Next slide, why do we need a DFI? Corporate India has no appetite to invest in greenfield infra projects in PPP mode. All of you are economists, you read the papers. I'm not going to make a laundry list of the litany of woes that corporate India has as to why we have no appetite for PPP, private investments in infra anymore. We are just about content with EPC, engineering, procurement, construction, which is just another way of saying we'd be happy to live with public expenditure in construction. We are not putting balance sheet money. Long-term foreign institutional investors, please note, have rarely put money into greenfield, fresh infrastructure projects. Most of the investments coming from the Canadian pension funds, the Brookfields, are to take over operating brownfield assets. Well, it has a positive point that it unlocks somebody's capital, but it doesn't lead to creating demand for steel, cement, or jobs. So you can forget the foreign institutional investor in a difficult market looking at development risk. Commercial banks, and I have colleagues from HDFC and others, are completely out of the game. Every bank CEO worth the name has said, we are not into infrastructure. And some of the institutions that were there in infrastructure, like IDFC and ILFS, are no more. The only institution standing in the name of infrastructure is a PSU, the Indian Infrastructure Finance Company Limited, which is so shackled by its covenants that it can hardly lend. So when you have this situation that there is no capital available, private sector balance sheet, whatever capital will not invest in PPP projects, the banks are out, the NBFCs are out. So where the hell are we going to get the 10 lakh crores from? And that's why we need a DFI. How do you structure a DFI? It's nice to give a motherhood statement which says, create a DFI. So I have actually given a far detailed presentation than this slide, which captures just the essence, because I had 10 minutes and I said, let me put it all into one slide. So our suggestion from Indian industry is as follows. Please relax the fiscal deficit constraint by 0.5%. The relaxation of 0.5% will yield broadly about 1 lakh crores of fiscal space. We have a target of 120,000 crores of disinvestment. I have not considered that. Please note that there is a separate target this time for asset monetization, which is selling ports, airports, power stations, bus terminals, railway stations, etc., etc. So asset monetization should give you 90,000 crores, assuming we meet that target. You got a 2 lakh crore equity there, right, available with the government. And now, as per all international norms, banking norms, you can leverage that 9 times. You can, on a 2 lakh crore sovereign equity bed, you could raise 18 lakh crores, 9 times leveraging, to have a 20 lakh crore balance sheet. And this is in that DFI, which is a standalone developmental financial institution for infrastructure. Can you raise 18 lakh crores? The answer is yes. With Prime Minister Modi's very successful external outreach, I think as a citizen of this country, I expect some degree of monetization of that goodwill. Let's give you one example. For one project, the bullet train, the Japanese have given us 90,000 crores at an interest rate of 0.1% for 50 years with the repayment of the loan to begin in 15 years. So surely if we can do this for one project, as a nation, can't we use all our outreach that we have, political, MEA, etc., to garner 18 lakh crores of debt from the Saudis, from the Gulf, to the Nordics, to the Canadians, to the Australians? They would be willing to put money if appropriately, if a DFI is appropriately, elegantly and transparently structured and professionally run. These are lots of other slides, but I'm just summarizing there. So that is our suggestion. This is the heart of my presentation. If you don't have this DFI up and running in the next 2-3 months, you forget about any infrastructure investments. Government fisc, is, as we know, is already squeezed. We don't know how the months ahead are going to be. Public expenditure infra is down. So if you want a pump priming of the economy, here is one solution. I'm sure many of you in the room have other solutions, but I thought I'd come to the house today with this solution. Reviving PPP, second last slide. This government did 2 things. On July 2014, in Mr. Jaitley's maiden budget, he announced 500 crores outlay for a new institution called 3P India. People have forgotten about it, right? That institution was supposed to completely levelize the playing field and remove all the ills and learnings of PPP in the last 15 years. We haven't implemented that. And later in the year, it also, in its effort to revive PPP, appointed the Kelkar Committee, which submitted a world-class report. If you read the Kelkar Committee report, which had members drawn from the cream de la cream of infrastructure intellectuals, it had pointed recommendations on what can be done to revive private investment in infrastructure. There are many recommendations. I've picked up what I thought were the 5 most, shall I say, critical in my view, and I'm not going, all of you read English, I'm not going to read out the bullet points. The 3P Institute is something that I've already mentioned about. Municipal bonds for infra, this is what capital markets should be doing. And I think many of my colleagues have addressed the Bombay money markets on this, saying you guys are doing far less advocacy from the NBFCs. I've spoken to JM Financial, I've spoken to many others, saying the private sector also has a role to actually push the system, whether it is the urban ministry or finance ministry, to actually move this whole capital market institution called municipal bonds and actually look at India's crumbling urban infrastructure and do something about it. But that's a secondary point. The main point is DFI. Project pipeline is a challenge. In simplistic terms, remember, an infrastructure project from concept to implementation in the best of times is 4 years, right? So for a 20 lakh crore investment every year, you require an 80 lakh crore pipeline. Now, God help us. You think we got an 80 lakh crore pipeline? So as much as all of us economists are worried, where will the financing come from? Where will the financing come from? How many people talk about, is there a project pipeline? Assume I give you a 20 lakh crore check today from the government. Where will you put it in? We don't have projects ready. The ministry has just about woken up to this issue because of us shouting about it and have created a national infrastructure pipeline portal, of which I am still to see how much traction there is in terms of reaching an 80 lakh crore pipeline to achieve, there is of course a starting stock, which I haven't mentioned here, but that's very small. I'm done. Thank you.
Well, you may we're not opening it up yet. But I think it's a useful lead-in to the views of the finance sector on this matter. And so who shall I give it to, actually? Because I think both of you would be able to talk about it. Let me begin with Abhi. Where is he? There you are. Your views on what the issues really that Vinayak has raised.
Just a couple of comments on specific things that Vinayak has raised. One is what he pointed out as the bank's reluctance to lend to any kind of PPP. I think the PPP models have seen some evolution over the last few years, and at the heart of the evolution has been an attempt to match the risk preferences of the private sector with the project risk, and consequently we have things like hybrid annuity model, the HAM model, which has been reasonably successful. And my understanding of banks, both my bank, HDFC Bank, as well as other banks, that they are comfortable with this model. So it is, I wouldn't make sort of a blanket statement like that PPPs are completely out as a credit avenue for banks. But I do see a lot of merit in thinking of almost the DFI seems almost like a sort of a canalizing agency for resources that are available all over the world to the infrastructure sector. This, of course, will entail costs. It will have some fiscal impact. I just leave Vinayak and all of you with the question is whether we sort of worked so hard on developing the corporate bond market. And again, the spirit and philosophy behind developing the corporate bond market was to remove the asset liability mismatches that automatically come in when banks lend for infrastructure projects, and then you have this NPA problem, etc. And one of the sort of the more specific roles that the corporate bond market was expected to play was to fund infrastructure. And I wonder, I'm very careful about these monolithic institutions, because we've had a history of institutional problems with them, and I don't know whether if you give the same kind of guarantees, incurring the kind of fiscal costs, and give a boost to a specific segment of the corporate bond market, which is inviting infrastructure money from the same kind of entities that Vinayak talked about. I really don't know how it'll work out. But I think that is an alternative. That is an alternative I think a lot of us have worked very hard towards. The final comment before I hand the mic back to Dr. Sen is that at this stage, I think the biggest element, which is, let me just say that, on a positive note, if I were to strike a positive note for the banking sector, there is some improvement. And one of the more positive changes is the attitude of the RBI. And the Monterey economist Michael Woodford once said, when asked about inflation targeting, he said that inflation targeting almost invariably degenerates into a caricature of inflation targeting, and I think we had some element of that earlier. So what has happened is that the RBI is recognizing, I think very legitimately, that there is a growth issue, and you can't have this narrative where growth is pushed to the corridors of the North Block, and the RBI just, tries to manage inflation. So in terms of specific developments that have happened, we have a lot of liquidity in the system. Rates have come down. The problem, as I see, is the elevated level of risk. And how can that be addressed? And since we are all trying to be solution-oriented, let me give you two solutions. With a little bit of a preface, because I think invariably in these models, and rightly so, fiscal and monetary policy reduces to issues of whether you're going to the government is going to spend a lot of money or cut taxes, or whether the RBI is going to cut rates or infuse money into the system. I think monetary and fiscal policy can go beyond that. And the two suggestions that I would make is to remove the element of risk that hangs over the NBFCs, because NBFCs are a very critical second intermediary between banks and the huge catchment of borrowers where the real needs and the potential lies, including the MSMEs. So solution one is to have a bad bank for NBFC assets, capital provided by the government, perhaps from the spare money that's lying from the NIIF. And in terms of monetary policy, I would just take a leaf out of what the Fed did in the wake of the great financial crisis. And going back to what Dr. Mundle showed in terms of interest rates and so forth, if you just drill down a little deeper, you will notice that good manufacturing companies, good service sector companies are getting money at very cheap rates if they go to the CP market or the bond market. It's the NBFCs, even the good quality NBFCs, that are not getting the money and are getting the money at very high rates. So I would suggest, why not taint the RBI's balance sheet a little? Let it not remain always lily white when the rest of the economy is in such despair, and let them do an open market operation in primary issues of NBFCs. I'm reasonably convinced that in terms of addressing the elevated risk in the system, this would actually be quite effective. It's out of the box, so I'm reasonably sure there won't be any takers for this, but what the hell?
Well, since you're on it, let me ask you a question. I mean, you clearly you're not particularly thrilled with the idea of a new TFI.
Yeah.
But let me ask you a somewhat different question, because you did bring it up and saying that the problem in the banking sector is that you have an asset liability mismatch coming from the term structure of the lending portfolio. How would you react to the proposal saying that let the banks borrow from the market, let the banks issue bonds on lending, which at the moment is not permissible under the Banking Act, right? What happens if you allow the banks to do that? Number one, it then doesn't concentrate the power into a single DFI. So you have, 15, 20 banks who are capable of doing so. They are the ones who are going to raise money in the market. You may actually kickstart a debt market. How would you react?
Oh, absolutely. And I think this reminds me of some of the solutions that came out of the UK after the financial crisis that the UK faced, and the Turner Committee report and the Warwick Committee report, where, banks have different ring-fenced roles. And what you seem to be suggesting is that instead of having one single monolithic entity, which I'm sure would have all the problems of monolithic entities in this country, why not have a sort of a ring-fenced division in different banks, which are completely dedicated to this infrastructure investment thing? I would suggest that maybe they should be, putting their money in infrastructure bonds rather than doing direct lending, because that would also give a fillip to the flow of bonds into the corporate bond market. And if we get a corporate bond market going in terms of pricing and a whole bunch of other things, it's the proverbial game changer for the financial markets in India.
Abhik, you were also, apart from what Pranav just asked you about, you were talking about banks doing this for NBFCs. So could you just say a little bit more about, because that is where the consumer demand is today being heavily constrained.
Yes, what I was suggesting were two things. One was just characterizing the role that NBFCs have, which is to borrow from the banks, because very few of them are deposit taking, and to, because they understand or at least understood the risk profiles of a lot of borrowers that banks are a little reluctant to touch. They were doing this thing of what I would call sort of additional intermediation. Now that has stopped, and that has led to problems. What I was suggesting is that if they expect institutions like LIC or banks to invest, or mutual funds for that matter, to invest in their securities of any duration, they don't find too many takers. So why doesn't the RBI step in and say that, look, I don't want a AAA balance sheet, entirely AAA balance sheet, right? I'm going to take, you do primary issues, I'm going to do a one-shot OMO just in NBFC bonds, right? Instead of having a liquidity window, it's the same, but I think this adds a sort of a long-term dimension to it. From a political economy perspective, and I'm sorry I'm blabbering on, it is easier to sell, because if you did it for public sector banks, for instance, which are issuing bonds for recapitalization, there's always this issue of, look, you are responsible for it and you're bailing yourselves out. For the NBFCs, it's a different story. They're not largely government owned. And the problem is really with the very active private sector NBFCs. So this thing of the government buying its way out of the crisis won't really sort of, at least optically, emerge for NBFCs. Let the RBI do an open market operation. You'll have money in the system. You will have the primary issues being subscribed to. Yields will come down, and you will have multiplier effects throughout the financial channel.
The Fed experience.
The Fed, if you remember, in the first round of QE, just said, let's wring the risk out of the system. The liquidity issue is secondary. We are doing it the other way.
All right, and that again promptly leads us to the thing that D.K. Joshi is best qualified to deal with. So what they are saying, in effect, both of them, is that the nature of financial transactions is really you're shifting it out of the hands of companies who are in the business of producing goods and services into intermediaries. And so a whole bunch of proposals about different kinds of bonds are being discussed. The question is that one of the problems that we've always faced is that it's extremely, extremely difficult to rate an issue which doesn't have an underlying asset. The assets that are going to be created are a derivative asset from lending to other entities. Does it or does it not raise the risk in the system systematically?
Well, I mean, from a rating perspective, I come from a rating agency, but I'm not supposed to speak about ratings.
Oh, I see.
So, yeah, so I think
but the general economics of it.
Yeah, I think, so I would not comment on what kind of a risk will emerge out of it, but yeah, I think if you don't have an underlying asset or a strong parent, let's say, I think things become difficult. If you look at the NBFC space, the ones which have strong parents are doing extremely well. I think they're raising money at the transmission from RBI's interest rates has been pretty sharp to them, and they're raising money at very, very fine rates. I think the housing finance, some of the housing finance companies, or even the government-owned NBFCs. So it does create a problem, I think. Let me stop. I think since it's a ratings issue, so let me stop at that.
No, but then continue. I mean, with what the other people have talked about.
Yeah, I think.
I mean, it wasn't a specific question.
Yeah, I think what we are witnessing, I think, from a 36,000 feet, we are witnessing that the role that markets are playing is increasing gradually. I think it's the banks, the NBFCs I think they will continue to play a role. But in terms of particularly lending to large infrastructure projects, I think government was trying to take the banks out of that space because ALM, etc. Now, I think bond markets are the logical solution for that. They have been doing quite well. I mean, they've been growing at 14-15%. And India is quite underpenetrated as far as the bond market is concerned. So the stress in the financial sector is a good time to push the bond markets. I think the Malaysian example we all know. And I think there you'll need to do a couple of things. I mean, one is that the ratings of infra companies are generally very weak. I mean, and so how do you need to create a market for lower rated paper? And for that, I think you need a system where the bankruptcy code works very effectively. And right now, I think the financial sector is out of the purview of the IBC. So you'll have to do something to ensure that people who invest in those low-cost paper, because you can't put contractual savings in low-cost paper, they are able to recover that. So I think that kind of a mechanism is needed. And I'm actually quite hopeful that the bond market will now lift. I mean, I think given that the stress in the financial sector is evidently coming partly from the way I think it was structured. So this is the time to both, I think in terms of intermediation, I think markets are going to play a larger role. And I think particularly bond markets for infrastructure will play a key role. I think that's the standard model, and I think that's what we need to push right now.
So are you then suggesting, if I interpret you correctly, that the government does not go in to directly borrowing from the market, but essentially backstopping borrowings that are being done by private entities? Is that what you're suggesting?
No, what I'm saying...
So that you're giving a certain degree of confidence to these issues.
Right.
And now, so what you're talking about is instead of a direct upfront payout, the government is actually taking a contingent liability.
Well, I think not necessarily. I mean, what I'm saying is that you need to develop the corporate bond market in a way, in an environment where people are able to recover their debt even if it is low rated. I mean, so that's the point I'm making. Because infra by nature cannot, unless you give a contingent
but this, again, let me come back to the point I was making. That look, the nature of the problem is that if there's a bond market which is a bond which is based on a real asset, right, then the IBC kind of procedure works.
Right.
But if the underlying asset is a derived asset, then the IBC procedure simply breaks down, because all you can do is to take over the financial assets, right? So the IBC simply doesn't work in these cases.
No, I agree.
Now the question then is that if you're going to get the bond market going, you're suggesting that you need a certain amount of assurance regarding the principal. Forget about the return, but the principal has to be in some form guaranteed, which means that ultimately the government has to step in. So the argument that we are getting is either you set up a publicly owned DFI, or which is a direct payment of however much billion you talked about, or you actually take on a contingent liability by backstopping private borrowings, right?
Well,
that's your choice.
I think to some extent, yes. I mean, because the infrastructure, given its nature, there are too many risks. I mean, unless so I think unless the risk taking is balanced, I mean, so somebody will have to give comfort. I mean, so as Mr. Vinayak was mentioning, the assets that are attractive are assets which are already ready. I think there's huge competition to buy those assets right now. I mean, whether it is roads or it is even transmission assets, I think people want to, the foreigners want to buy that because there is no construction risk and you can run the project effectively. So
this is the monetization of assets part of it that you're talking about.
So which essentially means that government will have to play a larger role as long as the asset is not ready. Once the asset is ready, you can bring in the private sector more effectively.
Okay, so now I think we've got this part of it reasonably well covered, but we still haven't really come to the question of the issue of macro stability and structural reforms. All right, on the issue of macro stability, okay, one of the things that everybody has been kind of tiptoeing around is the fact that the government has actually reduced its expenditure, not by actually reducing its expenditure, but essentially not paying its bills, right? Which means that the government is transferring a deficit from its own account into the accounts of the private sector, right? Now, this is a very unstable situation, because then what's happening is, whereas the government can actually raise money with government bonds or get the RBI to print money and give it to it, the private sector has no recourse. Now, if this to my mind is the immediate problem of macro stability. So if you say that macro stability is essentially about a 3.5% fiscal deficit, the answer that I would give is that that's actually creating a much larger macro instability than if you simply accepted that your actual fiscal deficit is 5.5%. How would you react to that, and what would you suggest?
Well, I think we need a system of budgeting where this kind of thing is not possible. I mean, you move away from the cash-based. But I would say that it's not that government doesn't recognize this. I think there was I don't know the progress on that, but government finance minister did announce that they are going to accelerate that. I don't know where they are on that, but there was an amount announced that we will clear the dues. But this has been a common problem. I agree. I think I also don't know. I mean, Mr. Vinayak would know much better as to what is the total pie which is unpaid. But this is a common problem, and what it does is, I think it percolates down. I mean, it causes problem for channel financing. I mean, because so right now we are in an environment where banks are also very reluctant to lend. So it kind of becomes, I think, feed into each other, and I think they tend to spiral the economy down, I think, as a result. I agree.
Mr. Srivastava, would you like to come in at this stage?
I would like to speak from my personal experience of implementing some of the major infrastructure projects. Basically, I would like to endorse the suggestion made by Avik and the other friend, laying more stress on the corporate bonds. See, I was in Karnataka state implementing the irrigation project on Krishna River, which is called Upper Krishna project. The Krishna water disputes, tribunal award came in the year 1972. The three riparian states, they were given their share, and they were given target to utilize their water share by the year 2000. That is 28 years, no time was available to them. Karnataka government started, the projects like irrigation department project, getting funding, from World Bank, and for all kinds of regions, etc. The project was not moving forward. The Almaty Dam, many of you must have heard, had become very controversial with regard to its height, etc., which was ultimately adjudicated in the Supreme Court by a constitution bench. So what we found was that the fund which was coming from World Bank was also having several other kinds of strings. And the biggest string was that the World Bank team will come and give all kinds of gyan to all of us, that you do this, you do that, etc. Consequently, things were just not moving. Government of Karnataka took a very bold decision somewhere in late 90s to access this market through the bond. And if I tell you the rate which was offered that time, you will all be surprised. The rate offered was 17.5%, and every 6 months the payment was to be made. So effective rate of interest used to be 19.25%. We started the whole thing, we created a special purpose vehicle, and I'm very happy to say that this project was implemented well before the deadline. And this has completely transformed the entire economic scenario of the northern Karnataka, which used to be otherwise heavily drought prone and things like that. So the message which I get is that there is enough money available in the market. When I was asking Sudipto what are the other avenues available to investors like me and him, see, people are actually craving for this kind of instruments to be available to them for investment, because they get assured returns, this is guaranteed by the government, etc., so there's no risk involved. And if there is a political will, certainly the projects can be delivered. So this is one example. The second example I'll give you in civil aviation sector, where I was joint secretary in charge of airports. I'm talking of 2006-2009 period, when most of these PPP infrastructure, airport projects were delivered and successfully implemented. There again, my own experience is that unless the two P, that is private and public, they work in tandem together, the PP project cannot be successful. What now we find is that in many infrastructure sector, the government P, the public P, becomes some sort of auditor, and all kinds of complications are created. So that's why, I will close by saying that if there is a political will to implement these projects, money is available in the market, and the corporate bonds is the right kind of routes, you will have large number of investors. Money can never be a shortage. This is what I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Chap, then, Avik, let me come back to you then. Again, on the question of macro stability. The discourse today, and this is fairly widespread, is that India's fundamentals are good. All right? Something which I haven't quite understood, what people meant. Yeah. But what really is your view of macro stability in India today, as of now?
Clearly, I think the fiscal deficit number is an issue, and I think it's an issue because we have kind of almost fetishized it to a point where we willy-nilly scramble to whatever we have targeted. I think there is a serious need, and a lot of us have been saying this, including DK, that DK Joshi, my dear friend, that transparency and the fact that you've messed up, but for legitimate reason, and you go to the investor community or the external stakeholder community and say that this was my problem, give us some time, instead of somehow managing the number where there are the fudges and the artifice is so obviously clear. I think we need to change the conversation in some way, because we are in a period in which the private sector has become extremely risk averse, and the risk aversion has come from things like not being paid by the government sector, so forth. So the government needs to play a bigger role, and to play that role, it needs to have a larger draft on the nation's resources. And given the absence of private in interest, I don't see crowding out as that much of a problem in the short term. Maybe there'll be a little bit of crowding in, and then you'll have to. The other thing that very briefly, I want to say that there is this assumption in our country which I find very difficult. It sort of doesn't resonate with what I was taught in macroeconomics way back in Presidency College, that fiscal now the canon is that fiscal and monetary policy should necessarily move in different directions. I see no merit in that argument, and I think that's another thing that at least the media seems to want to fetishize. I'm running out of words. Yeah. Some of them did actually, I'd still say
some of them did. All right. Vinayak, let me come to you on this. We've been really talking about how do you get infrastructure investments back, because it is important. And you made the proposal that, PPPs, there's now limited appetite. This will have to be done essentially through public funding. And given that, so you're really recommending an EPC mode as of now for the larger part of it.
Not if there's a DFI.
Well, the DFI, that's a good question. That was the question I was going to ask you. Yeah, that EPC mode is government actually pays out of budget, which, given the level of trust that exists on government's ability and willingness to pay, I think you may have a bit of a problem there. Now you're creating essentially a DFI and saying that the DFI will then take over that particular responsibility. Now, if you do that, so all you're doing is you are taking away the need for a private company to approach the market and letting the DFI do that role. That's what you're advocating, right?
Yes.
So the DFI essentially acts as an aggregator.
It does, and raises money at the cheapest rates because it has sovereign guarantees.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to once again answer to some of the points raised by my other two colleagues who are votaries of the corporate bond market as distinct from the DFI, and since it's a nice, happy debate, I will continue with my side of the rostrum arguing for a DFI. First, I've been hearing about this corporate bond market ever since I got out of college. And all of you have. Every seminar, financial seminar you go to from corporate bond market. अरे बाबा corporate bond market होता तो 20 साल लगता, अभी भी तो कुछ नहीं देख रहा है. Few growth here and there from a low base, you say 14% growth, you feel happy about it? Good luck. There is no corporate bond market for infrastructure. Period. You want to create it? Good luck. Point number 2. Debt. All this talk about banks and others is debt, debt, debt. Please note that infrastructure companies are implemented under SPVs, which are like companies. It has 1/4 debt, 3/4 debt and 1/4 equity, right? That is the standard classical. So please don't get obsessed about lending. Where is the equity? Who's going to give the equity? In the 60s and 70s in Nehruvian India, when private sector was starved of capital, the three DFIs, IFCI, ICICI and IDBI stepped in with capital, which is the reason many industrial groups exist today.
That's correct.
Right? So let's not belittle the contribution that DFIs made in a capital-starved nation for 3 decades before they went out of fashion. Today, infrastructure sector is capital-starved for a variety of reasons, and we need this intervention. That is my point 2. My point 3 is infrastructure sector has 3 levels of risk. There is development risk, there's construction risk, and there's operating risk. Would you want to put debt money in a high risk, and how much ratings do they give when you're at the developmental stage, when I'm bidding for a project, when I'm in the land acquisition, when I'm into utilities removal? On the real ground, the ratings are so low. Are you advocating that so many projects get stalled on the way? You're going to put common man savings into corporate bonds to put it at that stage of the infrastructure project when it is in that development risk, construction risk? I would certainly welcome it coming into at the operating level, which is what the FIIs invest in. So ask yourself, why do the FIIs invest only at the operating risk stage, not at development and construction risk? And would you put corporate bonds at these first 2 stages? It's a no-brainer. And finally, I think there is a need to push policy. The only thing that works is money. When you have a large monolithic DFI which says, I will not lend to the power sector unless you make these changes, the truly independent regulator, the state discoms behaving and not cancelling contracts unilaterally like has happened in Andhra, a large DFI, as I said, professionally run, now those are challenges, I understand. But when you say, I will put my money as a DFI, remember in those days, IDBI made a lot of changes in textile policy with their tough fund and various other things. A large monolithic has the power to say, I will put my money into this project, which is good for the country, but change these policies and behave. So there are many reasons why we require a DFI. As I said, on this side of the debate, I've finished my points.
Yes, I was just about to do that. Everything's gotten stuck up in the downside story. The upside story is still not, and it's in the nature of the topic, because if you think about the structural reforms part of the title of this thing, structural reforms are very clear from what the 3 of you are saying. From Debjani's story, it doesn't even seem necessary. Whatever structural reforms had to be done were done in the 90s, and they've been cruising since then. Now, the real question, Debjani, which is, forget about the software sector in itself. Think about the software sector really doing what you said it's doing now, which is helping companies to actually improve their efficiency, which is the focus of a lot of companies in India. This is the old Japanese model. When the economy goes into a downturn, you actually improve productivity. The $1 million question, and this is where the structural reform bit really comes in, is this. I can have two very distinct kinds of interventions to improve efficiency and productivity. One is the one we always talk about, which is improving the productivity of labor, which is almost always labor displacing technologies. The second is to reduce the material costs of production, that is the bought out inputs. What are you seeing in the market in terms of productivity increases? Is it that people are going in for robotics, or are people actually improving efficiencies in terms of the inventory management, in terms of the logistics management, and that entire range of things that lower the cost of raw materials and intermediates? What is it that you're seeing?
So, the software and services industry is it's a global industry, right? Our customers are all over the world, and it's a very different picture that's emerging. So if you look at the West, if you look at China, US, if you look at UK, the average median age there is 35 plus, right? And reaching 35 plus, I think, in another year or so. They are facing that problem where labor shortage is becoming a reality for them. right? So a lot of the decisions that are being taken today is to find ways to address the shortage that they have in hand. Right. So there's a lot of the way they are looking at technologies, how can it come in and address this gap that is being created, right? In India, we have a completely different problem. The median age is what, 26, 20, 27, something like that. So we are not, for many years to come, going to face this issue of not having enough people to do the work. And if we bring in technology and start taking over the jobs, it's going to create a huge problem for us. So we have to look at how do we bring in technology to do what you said, which is skill the labor to get more productive. Drive productivity via labor. And I think that has to be the approach to India. Now, India digital transformation is still very nascent. It's still early days. It has to evolve. And I think we have to have the right policies, etc., in place to ensure that it evolves in such a way where it is about skilling the people that we have rather than displacing them. And you see this playing out right now in the way the IT services industry is transforming. If you look at the hiring patterns within industry and you look at the skilling patterns within industry, it is not about robotics coming in and doing the work. It is about ensuring we find the right talent and we skill it in a way that they're able to do the job and they're able to do it with a higher level of efficiency. So I think these patterns are going to depend on the part of the globe that we are servicing and what is the requirement there. But India definitely needs something that is a people plus model.
The reason I bring it up, because quite often adoption of technology is sort of comes from a demonstration effect. So if I have the West, which is reacting to a completely different set of constraints, and are essentially doing people replacing technology, there's a very strong likelihood that there would be a Me Too effect out here. And we may end up, because a good company out there is doing it, therefore we should be doing it, doing exactly what you said should not be done. Right? Now, are we actually seeing Indian companies coming to the IT sector and saying, no, I don't want what he is doing. This is the nature of my problem, can you fix it? Is that question even being asked?
India has to have a new playbook. Adopting what the West is doing is not going to work for us long term. I think that's a realization that is slowly becoming, the awareness is increasing day by day. Are we having companies come to us, come to the IT services and say, this is how we need it? I don't think those conversations are happening at the level they need to happen today. Definitely not. You're right. There's a lot of Me Too. You see what's happening in the West and you decide that's best for you. But we have to start changing the conversations, because otherwise this is going to create a huge problem for India. If we ape the West today and we bring in their playbook to India, it's going to create a huge problem. And I think this is where industry, government, everyone has to join hands and ensure we create the new mindset. I honestly think a lot of these issues we are debating is about the old mindset. The world is changing, India is changing, and we have to bring in a little bit of a different mindset, which is thinking about India first, because we are in a unique place. We are, like it or not, in a few years, we are going to be one of the key economic superpowers in the world, and we are still going to have the largest number of poor people in the country. How do we balance the two? People is one thing we'll never be short of. So we have to figure out a way to leverage that and turn that into a strength rather than it becoming our biggest weakness.
Well, on that note, because I think the point that is being made, and I completely agree with it, is that one of the structural reforms, real structural reforms we haven't talked about, is a mindset problem. And mindsets are much more difficult to change than labor laws or land regulations. And we haven't even started talking about it, let alone have a game plan in place to actually start building this up. So I think we've moved to structural reforms of a very, very special kind that hasn't been talked about in the public discourse. At this point, I think we have run out of time for the panel itself, and I open the floor to comments, questions, observations. Can I start with Suman?
Thanks, Pranab. I'm very sorry to have missed the first half of the discussion, so my comment will be to what Vinayak started off saying. I have to say that he's responded in his second round to some of the issues. But given what Devjani just said, I will look at the pack to see what it has to say about productivity, because at the end of the day, total factor productivity, labor productivity is what this is all about. And the two tools that we economists have to think about what squeezes productivity out of the economy are basically competition policy and trade policy. So I don't know. I expect that Sudipto and his team have looked at the issue of what's happening on trade policy. I do want to say that competition policy in India tends to be somewhat neglected. And so the issue of whether competition policy is an additional tool that we can use to squeeze additional productivity out of the economy is important. I think for NCAR, the question of how much we are doing to measure and monitor what's happening to either labor productivity or total factor productivity becomes an important issue. There is the CLEMS work that I think ICRA has been associated with the RBI. But to me, something that a think tank has to keep its eye on is what are the productivity numbers. And so I missed the presentation, maybe they're there. However, I'm here primarily to respond to what Vinayak had to say on infrastructure. And my questions are essentially two. So, given the Einstein definition of madness, doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome, so what is the lesson to be learned from, say, IDFC? I mean, when I came to NCAR, the Rakesh Mohan report on infrastructure had been the basis for the setting up of IDFC. I don't know whether we know how that story ended, but we'd like your perspective on how that story ended and what we can learn from that, because we have HDFC, which is a successful model, and maybe ICICI, of models of people who started off down the DFI route and found that because of the deterioration of asset quality, the way that they could adapt was to get CASA, as it were. So what's different in the ecosystem of Indian finance today that we will not end up having another institution that goes chasing CASA because of asset quality? And my second question for you, Vinayak, is the demand really there? All you were talking about is on the supply side, but there was a headline the other day that basically thermal plants are shutting down because there's a massive slowdown in electricity demand. So what is the, as it were, institutional or investment structure that is best suited to deal with these ups and downs? And linked up to, in a sense, I guess the point Abhik was making is what prevents us from successfully, as it were, executing the Macquarie model, the European toll road model. I don't know if Pradeep is still here, Bajal Saab, etc. So, those have been, as it were, goals for infrastructure since who knows when. And is it demand risk? Is it political risk? Is it risk at the subnational level, risk at the national level? So what is it that we're learning from the past that will make the future different, given that we are, as Devjani said, a much more important player in the global economy, with all that implies? Thanks for your patience, Pranab.
Sudipto?
Thank you, Pranab. You know, while listening to Vinayak and Abhik, it appeared that they're talking about two very different things and at opposite poles, as it were. But in one thing, they have a common perspective. Vinayak actually even voiced it. I was going to ask him that question, but he said it. That basically he's thinking about, both of them are, by the way, thinking outside the box, and I think that's very interesting given the situation we're in. But his idea of bringing the, these DFIs back in, he actually said that this would be sovereign risk. And I imagine in your proposal, Abhik, when you talk about open market operations to help out with the NBFCs, that is also sovereign risk with the RBI. After RBI is owned by the government of India, so that becomes sovereign risk. So that is an aspect that you all haven't commented on, given that we are barely, in investment grade and so on. I mean, as a nation, what do you think would be the risk implications of adopting either of these two strategies? Because you have been emphasizing a big issue of taking risks seriously, especially in a macro projection and so on. So that's something I wanted your thoughts on. But also, if I may just float this idea, which brings together what both of you have been saying, and that is that if you have a DFI with all this clout that Vinayak talks about, and we can actually force behavioral change on the people who like to borrow.
Which the World Bank and the Japanese do pretty effectively.
Now, if you don't want, now who is going to, buy the shares of this DFI? It is owned by the government to begin with, but you could also think of a situation, because you all talked about, ring fencing part of lending by these commercial banks, developing the long end of the bond market. So far we have failed. But what about having consortiums of banks, especially public sector banks, but also private sector banks, them putting together some of the capital for this DFI? Because then it is not entirely sovereign risk, it is partly picked up by a consortium of banks, it is distributed risk. And so that's just a thought I'm also throwing out, really reacting to what you're saying. The other final point I wanted to raise, and this is with Devjani, you're very right, Devjani. I think we all agree that you need your own playbook to make things about how we should do things here. But the question I had is that is the playbook for a country which will look internally at what's where we should go, or a country which will need to compete outside globally? And we had earlier this discussion about our CEP and so on. Because if you're going to have to compete globally, your playbook, whatever it is, ultimately has to make you competitive in the global market. So that's really the issue I had in mind. The Chinese are great at, they do have their own playbooks. They borrow or steal whenever they want from the West, but they come out with their own playbook and it works. And if you look at what they've done, you talked about skilling, which is the tip of the iceberg, but behind that there is secondary education, there's vocational education, behind that there is basic education in the primary level, and the Chinese have vertically integrated reforms right through from the stage 1 to stage Z. And we don't even recognize. We have skills programs, but don't realize that that thing is not going to move anywhere unless you get your basic education fixed.
Yeah.
So, given the topic of macro stability and structural reforms, the usual notion of macro stability moves around inflation, banking, fiscal crisis, etc. These are the standard parts of it. Except that things have been changing internationally. In fact, the global financial crisis was not around these, it was around real estate. And in India, we have this thing sitting with us, real estate, huge inventories, and the price is not coming down. Now, that is one part of the story. The other part of the story is, in the context of structural reforms, land market is a big issue in India and it needs structural reform there. Now, there is a connection between macro stability and structural reforms here, because if you deal with the land market, structural reforms in one way or another eventually come down to the issue of making land cheaper. Now, the moment you talk in terms of making land cheaper, it becomes a big macro stability issue, because that is the most important asset, no matter to what extent we discuss the stock market, the bond market, and so on. So here we have a big challenge, how to get to a long-term higher growth rate with cheaper land, alongside ensuring macroeconomic stability. So I was wondering if there could be talk of this. I was a bit surprised it didn't come up at all, so I thought maybe I'll just talk about it.
Not everything can come up.
No, sure.
You're expected to bring it up.
No, sure, everything cannot come up, but something as important as this at a juncture like this is, which is what bothered me.
Okay.
But I take your point, yeah.
Yeah, sir. Mr. Vinayak, you referred to 5 trillion economy. I think it's not impossible to achieve it. It will be achieved within a year, 2 or 3. Modi government is very much targeted. The way Devjani pointed out, people concerned. I am also equally concerned. Whether this gap between rich and poor is taken care, how it will be taken care, whether technology can take care of it or somebody else has to come in between.
You know, when you talk about employment, we're talking about IT and software, but won't most of the employment come from hardware? And where is India in terms of Make in India and manufacturing, which is again heavily dependent on infrastructure? Services are all fine. I mean, you look for a maid, you look for a plumber, carpenter, they all seem to be very difficult to get. There's so many agencies employing them. So maybe that is the one employment intensive sector still going on. But unless you have manufacturing, hardware, we have virtually no hardware. In defense also, we have zero hardware. We are importing everything. We are importing a Rafale jet for 1,600 crores. I think that is nonsense. I mean, that's my opinion. Thank you.
Sir, I think my name is Alamdar Abbas. Make in India as well as make for India is essential to develop a new tendency of reform, transform and perform according to our current Prime Minister of India. I think India is showing a path of global peace and to make India more powerful nation of the world. According to the Piyush Goyal budget, India 2020 and 30, and he gives 10 dimensions. I think, is it possible?
Okay. So let's okay. Right.
ML Sharma. To my mind, I think the Indian courts have also played little negative role with the great respect, particularly in land acquisition and taxation matters, and you can say labor matters, because all the big investors, they are not coming forward. They have fear in their mind, particularly the scam and other things. They have not disposed of the matters, and this is one of the cause also for the present scenario. Thank you.
I have an observation to make on Madam Bornali's paper. Global trade today is going through worst phase in last 20 years. This is because there has been hyper trade nationalism. Number two, the WTO, with which I was attached, has become virtually non-functional. For example, the WTO dispute settlement system will not function from 1st January 2020 because it will only have 2 members, which needs 3 members for any adjudication. There has been global trade environment has been unsettled by many phases, like Brexit, etc. So the consideration and India's competitive index is not very high. So any trade estimates in the midterm review should take all these factors into account to have a very realistic, the situation in 2020 as per WTO estimates, as per IMF estimates, has not been very, very favorable, even for trade in services, which is the key strength of India. Thank you.
Dr. Sen, sorry, I have a flight to catch. So can I just maybe go answer to Sudipto? So Sudipto, my thinking is this is where we have to be seriously very creative. Yes, we have to be competitive with the world, but we cannot at the same time ignore India's people problem. It's a huge issue, and we cannot ape what the West is doing. And you talked about China. I'll share some figures which absolutely blew my mind this morning. China's parallel online universe. I mean, all over the world, when you think of search, what do you think of? Google. You think of e-commerce, you think Amazon. You think of social media, you think of Facebook, right? These are the three companies that are dominating all over the world. If you look at the China numbers, when you look at search, Baidu, 77%. Google is 3% in China. You look at social media, WeChat, it's I mean, Facebook is 2%, or just, everything else is WeChat. You look at e-commerce, Tmall, 62%. Amazon is something like 0.5%, right? Now, we can't get there, at least not in the near future. We can't create the parallel universe that China has created. But I think there are some learnings in terms of what do you have to do to, while you're globally competitive and you are a global player, you still have to ensure that whatever your resources and people is, you can look at it either which way. On one hand, it's a strength. On the other hand, it's a weakness. How do we ensure but that people problem and therefore a new mindset is absolutely critical? And a lot of people talked about Make in India. I think one of the most foolish things that India can do right now is just go about Make in India the way we have thought about Make in India in the past. The outside world is moving to robotics. Robotics is taking over manufacturing. Instead of Make in India, make robotics in India. Create robotics for the rest of the world. But we have to think through how some of these changes are happening and what is needed for India to be competitive and to ensure that we are creating the right level of jobs that's needed to keep our youth employed. So with that, I am sorry, I really have to run, but thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have a really, really urgent question for her? If not, we'll let her go.
Thank you.
Shekhar, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I did want to say that part of the confusion you alluded to in the beginning about balancing our current economic stagnation and downturn and the structural measures that's in there. It's precisely this kind of a discussion where, while we are focused on our GDP growth dipping, it's really important to see that our demography is happening every day. It's inevitable, the pace of change, the aging of the population, the fact that we are at a very young population still, but in some 20 years, 15 years, will be the world's largest labor force. And then in 60 years or 70 years, will be the world's largest senior citizen population. So we need to think a little bit about what it is that must be done, should have been done 5 years back. 5 years back, a task force could have started preparing Indian industry for RCEP. We could have really put in place the things that were needed, productivity increases, infrastructure access, credit, all the things that could have made us much more competitive today. So walking into RCEP, apart from the few things about, the ratchet effect and the base year, there are some 4 or 5 sticking points in RCEP. But we could have prepared ourselves much more for that kind of entry into the world's largest now trading bloc. So I guess this is the balance that we were trying to get to. Sometimes these conversations get to be very much about GDP growth next quarter, but I think we need to be very conscious that these are the futures of our children and their children that we are worrying about, and we do need to worry about them.
Thank you for bringing that into the conversation.
Yes, there was a very lively discussion on the need for long-term finance. And just draw your attention to a few empirical regularities. One is almost no country, especially the developing ones or what are now emerging, have developed without long-term financing, especially infrastructure. Now, two very interesting different models. One for reviving the DFI model, and other is, of course, the banks coming back through some kind of investment into infrastructure. I'd just like to draw your attention. There used to be something called a long-term operations fund. In fact, the problems of the DFI started once the LTO was withdrawn. The LTO actually linked the central bank to the development finance on a hands-off model. Hands-off means once the LTO was given to the DFI, actually it was not an equity stage. It was just a sort of a gift, if I may put it like that. It's a very crude way of putting it. That ensured that the state underwrote financing without actually getting into the business of financing. Unfortunately, at that point, the sort of a wisdom was that we must do away with it, and the DFIs went to the market, borrowed at something like 10 to 12. I think they were offering the highest rated bond, I mean, not rated, highest rate of interest on bonds, around 13 or 16%. I don't know, I don't remember exactly. And that's when the problem started, when after the East Asian crisis, the business turned around and all the companies went in for consolidation and all the debt became bad. So we had a good model which actually was given a bad name. So, I mean, unless we are able to bring back something where the state underwrites without getting into the risk, I mean, total contingent liability, perhaps DFI will not work, but it still perhaps is a good idea worth taking. As far as the second part is concerned, if you remember, there was a budget where we called something called takeout financing. Now, the takeout financing, I don't think it never got taken out. It just went down the drain. There is a basic risk there because banks, when they do it, who is going to take that? So, I mean, that idea went through, but unfortunately did not succeed. In fact, nobody took that idea. So I just wanted to sort of bring back some bit of institutional memory on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Since Suman mentioned my name and there was a lot of discussion on China, I just want to make a few macro points. I'm not going into these details. And I think those macro points are very important for all of us to consider. I've also written a book on China and I've dealt with these issues. Because how China suddenly became so big, how China, when they were equal to India's growth, as late as in 2000, they've suddenly become so big that everyone is talking of China, everyone is talking of these search instruments, etc. in China. This has been a very fast phenomenon. The problem today is that the world is moving so fast, it's unbelievable. First industrial revolution, 100 years, second industrial revolution, 100 years, third, fourth and fifth industrial revolution, 50 years. So what is happening? And that is natural and no one has looked at it. What is happening? The banks can't deal with this. Banks have not dealt with growth models where a bank finances and in 10 years the technology is dead and gone and you are with NPS. So you have to work at the Chinese speed. Now that's a very difficult question to answer. I will not attempt it today. But we have to understand that the nature of growth and the nature of industrial revolutions is changing. First industrial revolution was on steam engines, etc. Second was on assembly lines, etc. Third industrial revolution was on wire and wireless communications. And that's why the technologies couldn't be kept in the countries where they got developed, Europe and the United States. They went to China and India because there was a wire. There was globalization. Then China, then US, for some silly reasons, wanted to give it to China. And therefore the entire world has changed. We did far better than China in IT only a couple of years back. Chinese president wanted to take the chairman of this Narayan Murthy. He wanted to take him to China to start a number of companies. So it is not as if India was never ahead of China. India was ahead of China a couple of years back. Unfortunately, our lady friend is gone. I want to tell her that 10 years back we were ahead of China in IT. A couple of years back we were ahead of China in mobile telephones. We were growing at a rate which was 3 times that of China. So to change is not difficult, but we have to identify what's happening. And what is happening? Third industrial revolution, fourth industrial revolution, fifth industrial revolution on the same wireline of wireless. The medium is the same. The nature of the revolution is the same. You only have to tinker. There are any number of companies in India we don't know today who are using robots more than the counterpart companies abroad. Take for instance Maruti just next door. 70% of the workers are robots. So yes, I entirely agree. Robots have to be manufactured in India because we have been the starting point of the IT revolution because of the nature of stupid brains that Indians are made of. So we have to encash that. We have to encash all these Sundar Pichai's brains, etc., and build models, and they are simple. But what is required? The entire fourth industrial revolution is dependent on 5G, nothing else. If you look at 5G, 5G will change the world in 2 years. But what have we done on 5G? Do you see the spectrum? Do you see the spectrum pricing being finalized? Do you see the equipment being manufactured? Do you see the purchase of that equipment? So I just thought that such an enlightened group, one should start thinking on those issues. Of course, the problems of DFIs and the problems of courts and the problems of so and so in India will continue forever. And Tarun Khanna, the Harvard professor, says those problems are India's strength. I have not experienced that so far, but he says that the chaos in India is India's strength of the future because he says entire China will collapse like Hong Kong is collapsing. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have to sort of close down now. So, DK, for your final comments, views, whatever.
Well, I think I just wanted to end on a little positive note and look beyond. Do I need to answer the questions or can I be?
If you wish to, this is a discussion.
Yeah.
If you think that questions were irrelevant or not worth answering, please.
No, I think I can touch on the real estate part. I think real estate it's not that entire real estate is down. I think it's got a spatial dimension to it. The commercial real estate is still doing well. Actually, it's doing quite well. That I think the Canadian firms are buying commercial real estate left, right, and center. Actually, my office in Mumbai is also owned by Brookfield now. The problem is in the residential real estate, and that also in the higher category. I think the price point at which they are sold, I think there is not enough market. And this problem is concentrated in Mumbai and NCR region. You go to South, you go to Hyderabad, they don't have such problems in real estate as we have. So it's not a pan-India problem per se, but I think these two parts are so important that I think there's so much of unused inventory that the pain is going to continue, and prices not falling, I don't agree. I think prices are not rising in nominal terms. So in real terms, they have been. I think in Mumbai, you can still buy a flat at the same price what you could buy 5 years back. So prices have fallen in real terms, and so real estate problem is going to be a little tougher on the residential side to come out of, and it's been playing out for some time, and it's going to play out for some more time, I think, unless you exhaust the inventory. I think on the positive note side, if I must just take a quick minute, I think I'm a little positive on the next few years for 3 reasons. I think one of them, you have the corporate balance sheets, they're deleveraging. And I think this is a very strong, I think we see it on our ratings. The second thing that is happening is the corporate tax cut may not benefit the economy right now, but it has speeded up the deleveraging process. Actually, they have more money now. So whenever the economy turns, the corporates are primed up for capex. I mean, I don't know when that's going to happen, not immediately. The second is you are scrubbing the financial sector, and I think trying to clean it and also change the credit culture. When was the last time we heard that that promoter is losing his company, which is happening now? I think it's a pretty significant development. So you will have a banking sector where...
But you also had a low mailer.
Yeah. Well, but you probably moving towards a financial sector where the money that corporates get from the banks is treated as loans which need to be returned and not as de facto grants. So I think which was happening, I think, for the... And then it's a painful process. I mean, cleanup, we had the last cleanup was in mid-90s to late 90s. And you know what happened to the economy, what happened to the markets at that time. And the third is, I think, is a payoff from reforms. GST has actually, I still remember the NCR calculation that is going to push the growth up by 1 to 1.5% of GDP. Actually, it probably might have subtracted, I mean, because of the stress. So someday it is going to get streamlined. It is getting streamlined, and I think that positive payoff should be visible in the next 4 to 5 years. So I think these are some positives I thought I would like to mention towards the. Otherwise, the current environment is not that healthy.
Thanks, DK. Abhi, last words.
Quick words. Vinayak knows a lot about the infrastructure sector. I'm not a specialist in that area, and I'm sure he has a compelling case for championing the DFIs. But all I'm saying is that there will have to be fiscal costs. The government will have to put up money. Capital will have to be brought in. So whether a DFI kind of monolithic DFI kind of model works best, or whether we should look at a combination of corporate bonds and some initial financing is really the issue. And we have to look at this thing very carefully. I don't think we fundamentally differ that we need a big push for infrastructure. And finally, I think on the point of the RBI kind of tainting its balance sheet, the only point that I'd like to make, and I think there's a huge literature on this, that the central bank should not be treated like any other corporate simply because of the seigniorage function, and it can just, you can actually go bust. And then apart from some European countries, Lithuania I think once, where central bank credibility was an issue, it basically affects our swap lines and the rate at which we get it. I think there is, and the size of the OMOs would be so small relative to the overall size of the balance sheet that I don't think it really makes a difference.
I'm going to be like a stuck record, and I will respond to you. Yeah, I know, but it's no, I know you did. We will smoke it together. So to answer Suman Berry's question, the Rakesh Mohan Committee, the seminal 1997 India Infrastructure Report very clearly said an institution required to be created, as you pointed out, with an inverted commas, to lead private capital to infrastructure, which is the reason then Chidambaram created IDFC, registered in Chennai, etc., etc. It did not say we are going to create an institution which is going to cross its hurdle rate of return on capital of 16%. Infrastructure is a developmental sector. We've got to take care of electricity charges, water charges, build roads in remote areas. It requires a developmental agenda. It can't be thrown to the wolves in the marketplace right now. The only institution that can play this dual role of leading private capital at the same time respecting a developmental agenda, looking at the bottom of our pyramid and the provision of public utilities, has to be a DFI, because it can take calls on viability gap funding, subsidy on tariffs, etc., which a private player cannot take. I think that's the biggest public policy message, and the reason it went wrong is that IDFC gradually, and this happens when we Delhiites say that you get captured by the Bombay money market types, is that you suddenly want to delink yourself, you want to cut the umbilical cord from Delhi. Say politicians interfere, they make calls to us as to whom to lend. So this whole thing in Bombay is, as far as possible, distance yourself from New Delhi politicians, and therefore first thing you do is you list, and after that you become a bank. Okay, so that's the end of the story. Now what happens in a bank? You're talking about, at one level, you're talking about why the DFIs became, institutions like banks, because they had their eye on CASA. that you wanted retail deposits. Now, retail deposits are not the mechanism for putting into 30-year infrastructure projects. So therefore, on the other side, you have this great concept called an asset liability mismatch. Now, how do you want to play with this? You want CASA, you want to become a bank, you want to lend to infrastructure, where you've got fundamental asset liability mismatch problems. A bank shouldn't lend more than 3 years, because that's from old bankers will tell you, that's really the quality of the asset liability mismatch. So bankers lending to infrastructure long term is out of the question. What they can do is they can lend 3-4 year money for working capital. EPC companies, I can lend to L&T, I can lend to other companies to buy steel, cement, to construct a bridge or a road. That's 3-year working capital for EPC contracts. Sure, they can lend there. And if they love to call it infrastructure financing, it is infrastructure financing, but it is not developmental finance. It is working capital for an EPC project. So the basic point I want to make is, then why did PPP fail? Why did everything collapse? For two simple reasons. The risk allocation matrix was completely skewed. The concession agreements were in place without a parallel institutional mechanism of independent regulators and renegotiation and all other kinds of stuff. So PPP collapsed because of the foolishness of structuring projects with inadequate risk allocation, and that's from the government side, and private sector's foolishness of thinking that let's win the bid at any cost, बाद में हम ठीक कर लेंगे, या gold plate कर लेंगे, या दोनों ही कर लेंगे. Okay, so therefore, I mean, I can go on and on the subject. Therefore, I'm just saying that the reason for a DFI is to address the issue of a sector which requires developmental finance, a big push for public policy, which a big financier can speak to the government and do. The sovereign, and there is a huge pressure to reduce prices at which utilities are delivered to the poor. So it is the sovereign can raise money at the cheapest rates compared to any market player. The sovereign can take risks beyond its nose in terms of return on capital and the tenure of the capital, 30 years, 40 years. There's a variety of reasons for which today, I think, and I'm going to end my short speech, not very short speech right now, to say there are n number of reasons to actually think that the time has come to revive the DFI and infrastructure. We love the banks, let them stay on working capital.
Thank you. On that very aggressive note, let me hand it back to Shekhar to bring the proceedings to an end.
Well, it's been a very rich morning. It's almost impossible to summarize, and that's certainly not my role. I really do think that we both addressed what we had hoped we would address, which are the current problems in our economy and the absence of clear thinking on the way forward. We are fiscally constrained, monetary transmission is an issue, money for infrastructure projects is an issue. So I think we've laid a lot of the issues on the table. At the same time, I'm very glad that we've dealt with things like skilling, things like the future of competitiveness in our country and how we are going to match up as the world changes very rapidly and moves into labor-saving approaches to production. We seem to be one large pool of labor that still has to find a way to get the employment for these people. So I think we've laid a lot of the issues. As I said, this is going to be on our websites, IIC's website as well as NCR's website. We will produce shorter derivatives from this, so perhaps 10-minute videos or clips. You'll see a few things on Twitter already about specific issues being addressed. That's our hope, that people will look at this, it forms public view, public opinion, and that in the end influences our parliamentarians and our political leaders so that we can find a way out of the current situation while continuing to address the longer term issues that go all the way from K-12 education to skilling to all kinds of other factors in the agricultural sector, in the services sector, and in industry. As I said, this is not a summary, but I think we have got to some very rich discussions, which is the very purpose that Malcolm Adiseshiah had in mind in his time when he started this. With that, I hand over to our real host, Sri Srivastava, and of course, IIC.
Thank you, Shekhar. I would like to express our deep gratitude to all of you for participating in this very interesting discussion. No doubt we have taken note of the fact that currently our economy is definitely in crisis. Several solutions have been suggested, and perhaps a combination of all these solutions is going to be the ultimate solution. So I would not like to say much. Once again, I thank each one of you for participating in this debate. Thank you so much.
And I think I'll take the liberty of inviting everybody to lunch, which is in the same location where we had tea. And I hope the conversation can continue over lunch. Please look out for the book that will be produced as the result of this, and do remain active on social media. I'm not sure there was a specific handle for this. Meera, was there? Was there a... No. Yeah. But there will be, on the NCR handle, there will be a lot of material.